the only French social science journal to cover all forms of racism. She has numerous publications, the latest of which is L'Italie fasciste et
to the vertigo that grips the historian to metabolize a colossal scientific production, which is more easily accessible in the digital and open research age. It goes without saying that this 60 years later panorama will necessarily be incomplete and schematic, and so, unlike Mosse, who seemed delighted to be like the Christian among the lions, I appeal to your indulgence. So what was the state of art in the mid-60s, and what were the tools available for... Thank you. What were the tools available? I have developed this point for written communication, but for lack of time, I'll skip over it very quickly. Let me just mention the scarcity of comprehensive studies. Early research focused mainly at a national level that has been summarized by Renzo De Felice in 3 interpretative modes. And if we compare, so you can read what were the more interpretation in those times, and if we compare history of Nazism and fascism, the panorama of historical studies was less rich for Italy, and the interpretations established during the Ventennio continue to structure thinking. In short, in 19, and you should read the paper, which is in the box for more particulars. In short, in 1964, our knowledge of fascism was still largely dominated by the interpretations developed between the 2 wars, and almost everything remained to be done. Within this context, some of the avenues explored by Mosse are truly innovative. I will underline only some of them, which are not the subject of a specific section of our seminar. So you can see a few of books which existed in the 60s, and some were very important. And we can say that at the beginning of the 60s, Renzo De Felice began to be one of the more protagonists of historiographical debate in Italy. So what are these new perspectives? I will highlight on 3 points. First observation, all the reflection of Mosse on fascism is determined by one question, which is, how did the Nazis came to power? There is the quest for origins and the idea of a primacy of ideology. How did the Nazis come to power? And I can maybe quote Mosse, how did the Mosse of 64, how did the Nazis come to power, etc., etc. Like many of his contemporaries, Mosse is still haunted by the question of how could this have happened, and the search for the moment when Germany embarked on a fateful course. From a chronological point of view, these questions shift gaze upstream, leading to a kind of quest for origins through the exploration of Völkisch and German romantic nationalism. Obviously, this question of the beginning of the history is highlighted by the knowledge of the end of the history. Even in the early 1960s, the Holocaust did not yet occupy a prominent place in the representations of National Socialism and more broadly, fascism. While it was clear that the regime was criminal, the question was less about the conditions under which the crime was possible, even if some hits were suggested in the discussion, than about how the criminals came to power. A few years before Stanford, the first real history book on the Martergreifung was published by Bracher. Okay. Okay, no. No. No, I'm sorry, but I am lost with my PowerPoint. Okay. No? Maybe you will. Okay, so next. One more. Okay. Okay, so I was speaking about Bracher, and the book of Bracher was one of the more important books about the way in which the Nazi came to power. As the book's title indicates, the author reflects of totalitarianism, a concept at the heart of Bracher's analysis. Unlike Bracher, Mosse approaches the question from a medium and long-term perspective, the only one, in his view, that enables us to grasp the history of ideology, which he defines as follows: ideology to me the formation of basic attitudes toward politics, toward life. Also, Mosse is mainly a cultural historian. He's already proposing a highly innovative concept. Cultural history does not limit itself to establishing an intellectual genealogy, but aims to consider all aspects of culture, the history of representation, mentalities, aesthetics, and even gender issues. They are all issues that will be developed in later works. Nonetheless, his approach is restrictive because it undervalues the impact of the First World War and the economic and social context. Hence, the perplexity of the Marxist historian Paul Baran and the reproach to practice a mere history of ideas that can lead to plateau. Most certainly, the approach of exploring the intellectual origins of the Third Reich and more broadly of fascism is one of the directions that had been most precautiously delved into since then. Mauss was not the only one working in this direction, but he himself was to make a notable contribution to it. The 60s and 70s also saw the emergence of numerous works on the mechanism of the seizure of power. In the case of Italy, for the studies of the fascist regime, its institution and economic policies, we have to wait the beginning of the 19th. In Germany, as a result of the dispute between intentionalists and functionalists, they appear sooner. The other point, very important, is taking fascism seriously. The consequence of this culturalist and genealogical approach is to take ideology seriously. This approach is based on two assumptions. First, the idea that there was indeed a fascist ideology and culture with his coherence and the determination not to reduce fascism to gibberish, gallimatia, we said in French. Second, the refusal to see fascism exclusively as an anti-movement. This approach, according to Mosse, quote, denies ideological sincerity to the movement. Here again, we're talking about a truly new perspective that was to flourish from the 19th onwards in the wake of historians such as Emilio Gentile, Griffin, and Itwell. I think at the numerous theoretical works on ideology, often linked to the rise of the concept of totalitarianism. I think at the studies of intellectuals and academic or cultural institutions for Italy and Germany. This approach had many heuristic virtues. It can be highlighted in two areas in particular. First, the blooming of works devoted to the study of law in the fascist and Nazi regime. The notion of fascist law could be considered an oxymoron and a hazardous undertaking for fascist regimes born of the negation of the democratic rule of law. By way of illustration of such a perspective, I would cite the work of the French legal historian Olivier Joinjean, who, rather than presenting Nazi law as a non-law, prefers to describe it as monstrous law. He analyzed the form of rationality at work among the various actors, the conversion of the legal elite to Nazism, the characteristic of Nazi normativity, and the way in which, thanks to this law, the indefensible is defended. Second point, we could mention the study of racial sciences in Italy and Germany. Obviously, today we consider them as pseudo-sciences, but they haven't nonetheless mobilized researchers and institutions and contributed to justify oppressive policies. The third insight I'd like to return to concerned our reflection on the revolutionary nature of fascism. Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you. So here we have a real important approach, and you can read the analysis of Mosse. So for Mosse, if there is a revolutionary dimension, a political one, it doesn't translate into an economic and social one. The idea of a displaced revolution seems to me of particular interest, not least for understanding current national populist movement. We'll speak about Saturday, I think. The revolutionary dimension was largely ignored by most interpretations of the time, particularly Marxist ones, but it was already present among some analysis of totalitarianism. For example, in the book, very interesting, of the political scientist Sigmund Neumann. Yes, please. As you can see here. For Neumann, the revolutionary dimension is close to what Hannah Arendt described as the need for movement in totalitarian regime. For Mosse, the revolutionary dimension goes far beyond a simple logic of permanent radicalization. It's a project of anthropological revolution that is at work in fascism, even he didn't use those terms in Stanford. The revolutionary dimension in the political sense of the term was later explored in the work of Renzo De Felice, whose admiration for Mosse is well known. Emilio Gentile, a follower of Mosse and De Felice, and one of the leading contemporary historians of fascism, will make an essential contribution by exploring the various facets of fascism project of anthropological revolution, and more broadly, by analyzing the links between religion and politics. This revolutionary I have forgotten. Okay. This revolutionary dimension of fascism inspired theoretical reflection, and it is the core of the one-dimensional definitions of the fascist minimum. It also generated works on the policies implemented to forge a new society and a new man. Hence, the countless works devoted to youth education, issues very present in Stanford, and the rituals and practices of fascist religion. I would like now to speak about some dotted line questions in Stanford. After? Okay. First of all, we have to speak about the definition, the question of the definition. It was noting that Mosse is very relaxed about the definitional issues that would later obsess some scholars of fascism. His proposed definition of fascism evolved during the seminar. As we know, from the 1918s onwards, this question on definition will lead to particular heated debates among historians. Why such an endless debate? It can be analyzed as a symptom of the difficulty to conciliate empirical and theoretical approaches and the methods of historians and political scientists. On the one hand, there are inductive, multidimensional definitions based on historical reality and striving to involve as many characteristics as possible. The most emblematic from this point of view is the one by Emilio Gentile. You can read it at the left. On the other hand, to define a minimum essence to characterize fascism, One of the most widely used is one forged by Griffin. In 2004, Robert Paxton, in Anatomy of Fascism, rejected any prior definition of fascism, explaining that the historian's job was neither to find an essence nor to compile a bestiary. However, a definition does come at the end of his book. Paxton's approach, original and brave, had the merit of emphasizing the practices and singularity of fascism, which in its relationship to ideology which is not an ism like any other. Nevertheless, the refusal to provide a prior definition raises a number of questions, not so much for pedagogic reasons, but because the use of concepts necessarily presupposes an explicit definition. Do have debates and polemics over definitional issues contributed to the renewal of research? I think so. They have helped to decentralize viewpoints and open up research. Other point, the question of uniqueness and generic fascism, please. Another one. I've already mentioned the lack of substantive discussions at Stanford over definitional issues. If the question is hardly debated, it's no doubt because there is a common sense at the time for which the identification of a universe of fascism is beyond doubt. What fascism means is therefore almost self-evident at the time from a vision imposed by experience of anti-fascism. As I said before, at Stanford, Mosse mainly challenges National Socialism, but he defends a generic conception of fascism that he would later theorize. In the mid-60s, but even more in the following 2 decades, the idea of a uniqueness of fascism began to be questioned in historical works. The 70s and 80s were a fertile period for historical research, but mainly in national silos. Gradually, Nazism was defined as a word in itself. We have to remember in 1988 that historian Tim Mason expressed alarm at the disappearance of the fascist paradigm in studies of National Socialism in Germany in a conference entitled Whatever Happened to Fascism? And if we read today some books, I'm thinking of a recent book, French one about Nazism, we could say exactly the same thing. I have a citation. Okay. To explain this gradual erasure, Mason points to the post-68 retreat of the left among young intellectuals, the emergence of new struggles, such as feminism, that destabilized the theoretical frameworks for analyzing fascism, in which these struggles had no place, and the development of Holocaust studies, which contributed to the perception of National Socialism as a singular historical experience. It was probably the third factor that contributed to défasciser, I would say, le nazisme, to decouple fascism and Nazism. In the following decade, the Shoah came to occupy an increasingly important place in public debate. This centrality contributes surely to the development of historical research on anti-Semitic persecution and extermination and on the Nazi violence. But despite works that show that the Holocaust did indeed have a European dimension and involve many actors from the country concerned, this profusion of works further singles out Germany in the galaxy of fascism. The memory of the Holocaust soon came to occupy a decisive place in the imagination of the Western world, finally overwhelming all representations of fascism. Another point is about violence and war. I'll pass briefly over the lack of centrality of the Great War, which will be discussed later, but I have noted in the transcript that violence does not yet occupy a central place in the 63 analysis. It is discussed in the chapter devoted to National Socialist morality. However, at the time, violence was seen by the historian from a strategic political perspective, nor as a positive value, positive for the fascist, value in itself, defining the ethos and the new fascist man. In his later work on Great War, Mosse will present the Great War as a matrix role for this question of violence, and the violence as an ingredient of the DNA of fascism. In the last 2 decades, the attention paid to the impact of the Great War on the genesis of the political culture and practices of fascism is one of the most significant advances in historiography. The role of the First War has already been highlighted in Germany in the late 60s, notably in relation to the corps franc, considered as political soldier of the avant-garde of Nazism, but a new season of work has helped us to better grasp the nature of these continuities. We can mention the very relevant book of Robert Gerhardt. Violence is now considered not only for its consequences, but also for its practical dimensions and for its place in fascist rituals, liturgy, whether it be Nazi-fascist or Nazi-fascist or Francoist violence. I will end by the last point, which is, I think, the more important renew in the last 2 decades, which is the new focus of the transnational approach. Please. Have we seen Mosse announced his intention to study fascism as a European movement? It has to be said, however, that this call has been little-headed. So I would like first to speak, yes, about the ups and downs of comparatism. I am trying to write a history of fascism, and I can see that the real comparatist works are very few. In 1979, Mosse edited a volume entitled International Fascism, New Thoughts and New Approaches, which is in fact a collection of case studies. Very few of the works that approach fascism from an international perspective deal with a real comparative reflection. Authors juxtapose case studies. We can note, however, notable exceptions: Lacquer, Milza, Colotti, and Paxton in the 70s and 80s. I have analyzed in my paper why it's so difficult to produce a comparative history, but I think I will let you read the paper because maybe my time is near over. But the thing interesting is to understand that as it was difficult for reasons I can't analyze now to produce this comparative history, between Germany and Italy, for example. The history of the transnational history of fascism is developed for the last 2 decades. So my last points toward a transnational history. It is only in the last 2 decades that research with comparative dimension of Italian and German fascism has emerged about specific topics: foreign policy, the question of violence. I read with great interest the book of Sven Reichard, or on specific aspects such as leisure policy, where Italy was clearly a model. This renewed interest in the comparative approach must be seen in the wider context of the rise of transnational approaches. The transnational opening up of the historiography of fascism is part of a movement whose genealogy is probably not identical from country to country. It lies at the crossroads of several broader developments in historiography in the fields of cultural history, history of international relations, and the history of migrations. The transnational perspective had made it possible to go beyond the rigid framework imposed by comparative history by introducing the notions of transfer, entanglement, and connections. The concept of cultural transfer, which was particularly popular in French in academic world of Germanic studies, fortunately inspired the first collective works on a comparative and transnational approach to history. At the crossroad of the history of international relations and cultural history, the field of the history of international cultural relations has also given rise to a multitude of works on the phenomena of reciprocal influences, transfer, and appropriations. Thus, numerous studies have focused on the individual or collective travels within dictatorships, as well as on some of the figure or cultural and scientific mediators. These studies reveal not only reciprocal influences, but also phenomena of exchange, models and counter-models, reception and reappropriation. We can only agree with Federico Finkelstein's analysis in a work that contributes to this novel approach when he says that beyond national context and restricted theories, fascism then becomes a traveling political universe. I had the quotation, I see. The history of migration and population movements has drawn researchers' attention. Okay. No, ça fait rien. Thank you. The history of migration and population movements has drawn researchers' attention to the ways in which fascist doctrines were exported to Italian and German community abroad, and to the link between endogenous fascism and the foreign imprint. A number of books have demonstrated the value of studying fascism from this perspective transnational. In 2017, the collective work Fascism Without Borders was an important contribution. May I have 5 minutes? Yes, thank you. I'd like to illustrate the benefits of such an approach in 3 areas. First, about the fascist movement abroad. We have a lot of works now about fasci all'estero, AOI, but we don't have, and it would be very useful, we have it only for Latin America, a comparative analysis of Italian and German strategies towards this community abroad. Second point, the corporatism. Once again, this highlights the role of Italian fascism as a laboratory and generator of doctrines. Matteo Pasetti has drawn our attention to what he calls the itinerant potential of corporatism. Through the intermediary of academic and intellectual networks, and thanks to a highly effective propaganda offensive, corporatism established itself as a transnational corpus ideas. It also benefited a transpartisan connotation with an influence extended beyond far rights and Catholic circles, arousing the interest of certain reformist circles. International interest for corporatism acted as a source of legitimation for the fascist regime. The spread of corporatism helps us to think afresh about the questions of borders between fascist regime and authoritarian dictatorship. To put it another way, the analysis of the circulation of corporatism once again protects us from the twofold pitfall summarized by Paxton's essence or bestiary. More curiously, despite works that consider anti-Semitic policies in their entirety, I think of Hilberg, obviously, there is still no comprehensive analysis of anti-Semitism as an area of exchange and cooperation between fascist regime and movement before the Second World War. When I started to work on anti-Jewish persecution in fascist Italy, I proposed a paper on the cultural transfer dimension at work in the configuration of fascist anti-Semitic policies. At that time, the proposal met with perplexity, if not hostility, from a number of Italian colleagues. These were times in which, in the midst of the offensive, very justified, against the myth of the Bravo Italiano, historians were emphasizing the autonomy of the Italians in the decision-making process of 1938. Strictly speaking, this autonomy was real. But to explain, in my opinion at least, Italian intellectual genealogy was less relevant than a geopolitical context specific to the fascist galaxy and a domestic political context. Without subscribing to an enchanté vision of the situation of Jews in the liberal Italy, we have to observe that Italy presents a radically different situation with respect to anti-Semitism than Germany or France. From a domestic political point of view, the adoption of the racial laws came in a precise moment at the time of a stasis in the regime totalitarian dynamic. Finally, from a geopolitical perspective, the anti-Jewish law must be seen in the context of the collaboration-competition relationship between the two Axis partners. Rather than ignoring Germany, elephant in the room, and considering the racial laws as the revelation of a fascism that was anti-Semitic from the outset, it seemed preferable, in my opinion, to reflect on the mechanism of 1938 in the context of a dynamic specific to fascist regime and their totalitarian nature. To conclude, I'd like to emphasize the virtues of the transnational approach. Useful to play down the question of definition. If we accept that fascism and National Socialism were indeed matrix regimes, they appear as forms of yardstick, yes? Okay, for observing affinities and variations. It allows us to understand fascism as a universe or nebula. As a universe, fascism is on the rise in the interwar period. Like a universe, fascism is in motion with dynamics of attraction and repulsion, of exchanges between unequal forces. Like the universe, it is structured about stars, stars without positive connotation, rising or waning stars, Italy and Germany. The notions of fascist effect or reverberation are useful tools for thinking about their relationship. By their very nature, nationalist regime and movement cannot be auto-defined in relation to another national model, to an alternative homeland. However, similar nationalist movement and regime can be defined by aligning or differentiating themselves in relation to the matrix regimes of Italy and Germany. Thank you very much.
We will now have our first response from Aristotle Callas, a professor of modern and contemporary history at the School of Humanities, Keele University in the UK. He is an expert in the study of comparative transnational generic fascism and architecture and urbanism in the interwar period, with a particular focus on Italy and Rome, but also within a comparative historical context. His most recent books include The Third Rome, The Making of the Fascist Capital, The Minimum Dwelling Revisited, Schiem's Practical Utopia, and he's currently working on 2 monographs, Fascism and Iconoclasm and Fascist Assemblages.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to also extend my thanks to the organizers. But it's a rare privilege to be involved in an event that's organized by 2 very important institutions. And you know, you mentioned that that I have worked in urbanism and architecture. Well, being in the Sapienza in this particular campus is a bit of a privilege for me, but also what a privilege to be at the American Academy. So thank you very much for the hospitality of both. I have noted the call of the organizers of this conference to not relitigate the 1963 seminar. So I will not do that, but I will play a little bit with it, just to begin. So as I was preparing for this, just writing the paper, I was trying to experiment a little bit with what is new. I mean, a lot of things are new, but then a paper like this would end up feel like a catalog of newness in that respect. So I thought, what would a paper with that title be like at the Stanford Seminar in 1963? And of course, it would be either a very short paper or not a very interesting paper. What is new in fascism studies in 1963? I don't even know whether the idea of fascism studies meant anything in 1963 to begin with. So in that respect, we have a much easier role than a more difficult one, because we stand at a much bigger distance today from the 1963 seminar that the people, the participants of the seminar, stood from fascism, let alone from anything else. So there's a lot that happened and a lot of very fruitful things that happened. And being second, of course, I don't have to repeat a lot of things that my colleague has already mentioned, even if we intersect quite a lot. So in that respect, of course, a lot of things have happened in that way. But then again, the people, the participants of the 1963 seminar, most, of course, the most important by virtue of the structure of the seminar, were real pioneers of the field. They were trailblazers. They were map makers. They were setting the parameters of what would become that fabled fascist or fascism studies. So we don't have that license, we don't have that opportunity. So we're kind of stuck in between these two. I also thought of the context. The context is very different. In 1963, fascism was a still quite raw past that was felt and was still being felt at the time. But it was also at the same time a little bit more distant in comparison to what is happening right now. We live in a context where the word has come back to haunt us in ways that we hadn't probably anticipated. So in that respect, the context is very difficult. Different. 2 years ago, my dear colleague Manuela Consoni had invited us in Jerusalem, and we had a similar discussion. And I was thinking how much has changed in these last 2 years. And it goes to prove. So in the best Mossean tradition of contemporary history, we're always confronted with this fascism as present past and at the same time as present future. And this is a very interesting challenge, if you like, to have in mind in that respect. In a nutshell, and if you're tired already, you can switch off after this. In a nutshell, that field of fascism studies, that the 1963 seminar did so much to define and turn into a productive field, has matured substantially in the last 60-odd years. It's a field that has gone through distinct phases. When I play with this kind of generalizations of 10 words or 20 words, I think that we start with a story of essence. Then at the same time, we get confronted with a story of origins, but we have moved on also beyond this, especially in the last 2 decades and so on and so forth. And I would just offer this as a reflection before I go through some of the milestones, if you like, and what I think very interesting changes have been. I would offer this as a point of reflection. I wonder what point such a discussion would have about fascism and what fascism is, and whether it's revolutionary, and whether it's palingenetic, and whether it's paramilitary, and whether it's all this totalitarian, I'm referring to the first stage and so on and so forth. There would have been very interesting intellectual discussions, but they are even more important and interesting because of something else that we as historians are confronted with, which is the fact that whatever that fascism was, the really interesting thing is that it gained spectacular traction in the 1920s and 30s. So we could have been here discussing the radical outliers, the footnotes of history, but we're not, because people, ordinary people as we call them, but also political elites and people from other parts of the political spectrum, not only our outlier radical startups, but people who were part of the political mainstream and the political establishment chose to engage with that new radical reality that had for somebody who was starting in 1919 and looking at what Mussolini does in 1919, in many ways, they would have been forgiven for thinking it's got failure written all over it. And yet it didn't, and yet it became so important. So that question of traction, of appeal, you talked about circulation, I did as well in my original paper, is really, really important because it gives a different hue to our discussion about definitions, about transnational connections, about all sorts of things in that respect. And I think one of the really positive things in the last 60 years is that we have moved we, the people who have become involved in the discussion of fascism, we have moved from an initial, forgive me for saying this, an initial obsession with what fascism is. We saw, which was very important in 1963, okay? So I want to be clear about this one because there was no field to navigate. But we've moved from this kind of era of what fascism is, and then this not so nice era, in my opinion, of fascism versus fascism, what fascism is not, to an era of what I think has been happening of fascism and fascism as part of this kind of opening up of the vistas, which to me is probably the most positive and a welcome change. Now, in 2004, 20 and a bit years back, it's funny, writing about these things brings back all these memories. There was a debate, and I think some of us who are here were invited to this debate. It was organized by a German journal, Erwägen, Wissen, Ethik, and it was about, in some respects, a version of what's new in fascism studies. The new in fascism studies, and I will not get into a lot of details into this one, of course, was Roger Griffin's decade-long, by that time, definition of fascism. You saw it earlier on in the presentation, but also his claim, rather provocative claim, that there is now a new consensus. Okay, now I'm not going to get into this discussion, but it was interesting as a participant as well to look back at this debate, because the format was quite different to what we're doing today. So it was all conducted virtually through the pages of the journal. There was a main article, there were responses, and then there was a main article from Roger Griffin, responses, and then a response from Roger Griffin, and a final round of comments. So not different, but not similar either. Not too different, but not similar either. And looking back at this, I was struck at how interesting intellectually, but actually non-productive that exercise was. And in my opinion, that was a milestone. It was, I'm taking some liberties here with the chronology, but it was what I consider to be the end of the definitional cycle. A cycle that had started with the pioneering work of Moser. I mean, there is the word definition coming up in the Stanford papers a lot. Of course, we go into the 80s and 90s where the definitional debate peaks. And it becomes involved in this discussion of what I said, what fascism is not. And that was the peak, because in many ways, and I think many of us, and I'll speak mostly for myself, but also for some colleagues that I have an opportunity to talk about afterwards, it was a realization that the battle lines are drawn, people will not move on the definitional front. What's the point in having this discussion and banging against the wall? But before we go to that point, I want to mention two names, and they stand on either side of this 2004, if you like, terminus. Those of us who have been working in fascism studies will probably have at some point read and definitely mentioned many, many times 1979 article by Gilbert Allardyce, What Fascism Is Not. And it was a moment where Allardyce reacted to the opening of the field of fascism studies that Moser and other people and Stanford were trying to achieve. So it was the backlash. It was like, you've gone too far, okay? That article is referenced too many times, in my opinion, guilty as charged. It's a very interesting discussion, but it is one of the articles that is known most for its notoriety than for other things. Fast forward a few things. In 2012, I was invited, technically I co-organized, but I was invited by my colleague Antonio Costapinto, who is here in an event in Lisbon. And there I encountered a scholar of sociology who was involved in fascism studies, but was not a fascism scholar, if you like, who did something similar to what Gilbert Allardyce did, but from a very different point of view and with a very different intent. I was very lucky to have met Michel Daubry, and as part of that meeting, Michel Daubry wrote a paper, and I had the opportunity to reread this chapter while preparing this. And it's a very interesting paper. He starts from the point of what became quite standard criticism of these definitional approaches to fascism and this tendency to try and categorize and create criteria and taxonomies and try and say, oh, this doesn't fit, therefore it's not fascism, and so on and so forth. And Daubry reacted to this, but unlike Allardyce, who was trying to say, do not do this, do not do that, do not conflate these two, he went exactly the opposite way. He said, compare the incomparable, open up, embrace the difference in comparison rather than the expected similarity. And something else, he said, as a kind of exhortation to fascism studies, to which he was referring when he wrote this, change the enigma, by which he meant ask new questions and expect that these questions will not deliver similarities, but they will open up the vistas that will make us even realize the fact that this little fascism, into inverted commas, as a cognitive field that we're talking about, has so many impacts and sometimes collateral effects in the other areas. I've turned back to this chapter many, many times, because I think this is what is happening anyway in the field of fascism studies ever since. Embracing the gray zones, which incidentally is in the best Maussian traditions as well. Extending, expanding, not shying away from leaving the comfort zone of a specific, well-defined area. Mauss was one of the first people who acknowledged that fascism, even in his effort to try and give it intellectual substance, he acknowledged the fact that if you look individually at what fascism was doing, what it was espousing, there's not much originality there in individual aspects. We talked about nationalism, we talked about the state, we talked about totalitarianism, we're going to talk about all the other things. The alignment, the synthesis, the narratives constructed, and of course then the radicalization makes a lot of sense. Moser was talking about fascism being a scavenger, which I think is a wonderful metaphor, and in so many ways. So I see this kind of the end of the definitional and the fascism is not sort of discussions, opened up this language, but also shared field to begin to ask these broader questions. Where does this take us, one way or another? You talked about transnational, so I will not talk about this in any detail, but what did the transnational approach offer us? It offers us an understanding of the fact that not only is fascism unintelligible, confined into artificial national containers, obviously, but it also made us realize something else, that a history of fascism cannot be told through the lens of it being something fixed. Fixed intellectually, fixed politically, fixed culturally. So we have to trace the connections. We have to trace fascism's ability, knack for appealing, for crossing borders, the protean nature of it as it was crossing borders, and to stop thinking of all the, we talked in the morning about the primary role of the Italian and the German model, of which Paxton is one of the main reinforcers with his 5 stages, much that I have a huge respect for this work. This idea of the peripheries of fascism as people who are largely or mostly or to some extent imitate something, that fascism sort of crosses borders as something fixed, and that the people who receive it are just waiting there for it to be enlightened by it and to copy it, that all these ideas have come under a lot of pressure. We have people, a lot of people, we meet every year or so, some of us, and we discuss new research in the so-called peripheries of fascism, in places like Central and Eastern Europe. I was born and raised in one of them. If you want to test the limits of what fascism is not, dip your toes into Greek fascism, and so on and so forth. And yet all these questions are really interesting and enlightening about this story of circulation, not even diffusion. I wanted to mention one more name and then I will conclude. Again, from somebody who is not a standard fascism scholar. Kurt Weyland, political scientist. I hope he will be okay with me calling him that. Published a book. He epitomizes, in my opinion, what I would call the diffusionist approach to fascism. Now, diffusion is a funny word because it may still imply that there is something sitting on a shelf, see Italian fascism, National Socialism, and so on, that then gets diffused and others pick up and say, oh yes, okay, this is what it is. He doesn't mean that. But he makes a very interesting point. He says that we have to accept the fact that what really diffused and the real success of what we call fascism in the 1920s and 30s was not the radical outliers, but the fact that fascism became a catalyst for a wider authoritarian, anti-democratic, and so on wave. This is what I meant by the kind of research on the collateral consequences of fascism. That even when we say that, and I use the example of Greece in my case, I mentioned a couple of scholars who work on Greek fascism on my paper, even when we talk about country X as a case of a failure of fascism, what we also have to confront is the fact that in many cases there was a shift to authoritarian solutions. Dictatorships, the history of dictatorships is much bigger than the history of fascism, and yet it's so interwar dictatorships, and yet it's so intimately linked in some respects as a collateral effect. And what Weyland offered to this discussion was that he said that the story of fascist diffusion is not just of people enthusiastically embracing fascism, it's also a story of people who reacted to it, in many cases by accepting some parts of it and then using them to turn against the real fascist, into inverted commas, which to me is a very interesting way of thinking about some recent analysis of this circulatory idea of fascism. So from the story of essence, from the story of definition, from the story of what fascism is not, for the story of origins, constructing these genealogies of fascism, reverse engineering fascism intellectually, very dubious intellectual exercise, very interesting, but very dubious. We're moving towards a story of expanded vistas and, above all, a story of connections, of movement, of dynamic, of process, of contingency, of unpredictability of that thing that we call fascism. I will finish with again, a very, very short reflection. As part of me researching this paper, thinking of what I write of this paper, I had the opportunity to read George Moses' memoirs. And it's one of those quotes that I think I have seen somewhere else, but about his intellectual restlessness. That he was a traveler, somebody who was always moving, who didn't like stasis, and so on and so forth. And I think one of the ways in which the study of fascism has benefited immensely in the last, not 60 necessarily, but definitely 20 or 30 years, is that we have adopted different, to use a very contemporary digital analogy, different levels of solution. Some of us are zooming out, going for the bigger pictures and the connections of the broader pictures. Some of us are zooming in. And as you zoom out, as you zoom in, there are interesting patterns that come and go. Somebody who's zooming out is able to see more generic patterns. Somebody who's zooming in is kind of sometimes consumed by difference. But this is the important part of it. So this is something that has become a trademark of what we can call fascism studies in that respect, to continue to adopt these different perspectives, but also a shift towards the opening up of the vistas. And as a final point, I was thinking, I am here doing this reflection on what's new in fashion studies since then. And I think that the participants of the 1963 seminars would have been quite happy with the discussions we're having right now, even if they don't agree with everything. And I hope that a similar paper 60 years from now will be able to chronicle the expansion, the continuing expansion of the field of fascism in that respect. Thank you very much.
And now we will have our final response paper given by Brian J. Griffith, an assistant professor of modern European history at California State University, Fresno. He writes and teaches courses on the political and cultural history of Italian fascism, food and beverage history, the history of transnationalism, and digital and public history. He has worked on national identity in Mussolini's Italy, the history of transnational volunteerism during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, and the Spanish Civil War, and the history of neo-fascism in Italy between the 1950s and the 2010s.
I'm going to try something rather unorthodox and balance, however precariously, this microphone. Are you guys able to hear me? Okay, I tend to speak rather loudly anyways, so hopefully it won't matter. Yeah, I'd like to begin by echoing my colleagues' thanks to the conference organizers and also our hosts at Sapienza and the American Academy for making this conference possible, which I think is not only important historiographically for our literature, for our field, but also really important and rather urgent. Okay, then I'll have to hold it. All right, I'll just do this the traditional way then. A conference that I think is really important not only to the literature and the future of the field in terms of academic knowledge production, but in terms of the wider picture, rather urgent, right, that scholars such as ourselves come together and have these debates, since we are living through what we might consider to be a kind of new wave, right, of fascism. In 1932, 10 years after taking power as prime minister of Italy. Do you mind if I take that for I can change my my slides? Thank you. Yeah, I think I'll have to hold it very high. All right. 10 years after taking power as prime minister of Italy, and 7 years since his declaration of dictatorship in Italy's Chamber of Deputies, Benito Mussolini and the fascist philosopher Giovanni Gentile penned a working definition for Italian fascism, which included its purported intellectual influences, its ideological viewpoints, and its socio-political objectives as they were understood in the early 1930s. Oh, wait, did I go too far? Very good. Published in the Italian Encyclopedia, the political and social doctrine of fascism serves as an important historical benchmark for grappling with what fascism in its original interwar Italian incarnation was, and to a limited extent, continues to be today in its various global expressions. And yet rivers of proverbial ink have been spilled by scholars during the 82 years since the publication of Mussolini and Gentile's essay towards the identification of a quote-unquote generic definition or description for this third way ideology, with very little agreement among scholars regarding the ideology's fundamental impulses, expressions, and praxis. What explains this lack of consensus among scholars regarding fascism's key features? And what solutions, in terms of scholarly approaches and methodologies, might be awaiting our adoption towards a more productive and potentially unified community of scholarship? In this presentation, I will both provide a general overview of the various historiographical debates and turns in fascist studies, roughly from the 1960s through the 1990s, and offer some cursory observations and suggestions for potential methodological innovations regarding the elucidation of what Ernst Nolte famously dubbed as the fascist minimum moving forward. In seeking to resolve the stagnation which has occurred with respect to the question of generic fascism, I contend that a combination of methodological approaches of visual studies, transnational history, and digital history may very well prove useful in our field's mission of nailing down an empirically grounded, more universally applicable description of what fascism is and, by extension, is not. Doing so is all the more urgent, I would strongly suggest, given the proliferation of fascistic movements and political leaders all across the Western world and beyond in recent years. Quote, if we cannot examine fascism synthetically, as Robert Paxton has aptly observed in his 1998 study, The 5 Stages of Fascism, noting the importance of returning to the question of universal fascism, quote, we risk being unable to understand this century or the next. There we go. In the decades following the Second World War, historians of modern Europe began examining the origins and outcomes of various fascist movements, and in only in a few cases, dictatorships, seeking to better understand the underlying qualities for what some insisted was a kind of generic or universal fascism linking all of these movements and governments together. While some scholars took fascist politics and culture seriously from the beginning, such as Renzo De Felice, among others, the majority of what I will refer to here as the first wave of fascist studies of interwar European fascisms largely disregarded these ideological communities as little more than totalitarian bulwarks against the spread of Bolshevism, or to quote the 20th century Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce, a temporary quote-unquote parenthesis in an otherwise enlightened or normal historical trajectory. By the late 1960s and onwards into the following decade, however, scholars of ultranationalist populisms had begun to overcome these largely self-imposed analytical obstacles by exploring these interwar movements and dictatorships as novel socio-political projects in their own right, intimately bound up with the tensions and antagonisms of industrial modernity, as opposed to Sonderwegs in an otherwise typical path to social, political, and economic modernization. Among the earliest contributors to the critical study of European fascisms in this fashion, was the German historian and philosopher Ernst Nolte. I wonder if the PowerPoint difficulties will count against my time. There we go. In his 1966 monograph, The 3 Faces of Fascism, Nolte explored the histories of 3 early European fascist movements and/or regimes, the Action Française in France, Benito Mussolini's Fasci Italiani di Combattimento movement in Italy, and the National Socialists in Germany. In comparing the doctrinal systems of these 3 ultranationalist movements in post-World War I Europe, Nolte developed what he referred to as a fascist minimum, or the constellation of ideological viewpoints, socio-political values, and collective practices shared between these 3 ultranationalist communities. Quote, fascism, Nolte writes, there we go, is somewhat vaguely outlining his definition of universal fascism, quote, is an anti-Marxism which seeks to destroy the enemy by the evolvement of a radically opposed and yet related ideology, and by the use of almost identical and yet typically modified methods, always, however, within the unyielding framework of national self-assertion and autonomy, end quote. Although Nolte rightly identifies anti-Marxism as among the motivations for the various movements and/or dictatorships loosely labeled as fascist, in particular the Third Reich, whose anti-Bolshevism served as just as much of a motivation for ultranationalist purificatory violence in interwar Germany as anti-Semitism did, The remainder of his observations here lack a certain clarity and intended meaning. Nolte, however, was not alone in his quest for identifying a fascist minimum. It doesn't want to go. And then it'll go through. Oh, I think this is it. Okay, good. In his 1979 essay, published in this monograph here, Toward a General Theory of Fascism, George L. Massey explored not only the various continuities between fascism, generically conceived, and developments from the 18th and 19th centuries, thereby establishing fascism as an emergent byproduct of Western modernity, but also the ideas and values, worldviews, and objectives shared in common between Mussolini's and Adolf Hitler's respective dictatorships. Intended to outline, that might be helpful, yeah, if you can do that, thank you very much. Here we are, that's good. Intended to outline, however, cursorily, the quote-unquote building blocks for a general theory of fascism, Massey's study encouraged other scholars of fascism to abandon the doctrinal approach to exploring the history of fascism and instead examine the phenomenon as a kind of quote-unquote attitude toward life, end quote, based upon a quote national mystique, which might vary from nation to nation, end quote. Although not quite a fascist minimum, as had been the case with Nolte's monograph, Massey's building blocks approach helped both to close the proverbial door on fascism as an aberration and open up a new analytical and methodological pathway for subsequent scholarship to follow. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, however, a new wave of scholarly interest in the quest for a fascist minimum began emerging, influenced this time largely by the cultural turn. Continue the slide one more time. Roger Griffin's 1991 monograph, The Nature of Fascism, for instance, serves as one of the earliest and lastingly influential contributions to the scholarly resuscitation of generic fascism. In broadening the field's focus beyond just the question of comparing fascist Italy to Nazi Germany, and inevitably arriving at the contrasting differences which had flummoxed previous generations of historians, Griffin proposes a description for universal fascism which is centered around the quote-unquote myth of national rebirth. If we do that again. Thank you. Fascism, Griffin succinctly maintains, quote, is a genus of political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism, end quote. Unified by a shared anxiety regarding the perception of national decadence or decline, and dedicated to deploying forms of purificatory violence towards the healing of the national community from its various externally and internally inflicted wounds, Griffin contends. The, quote, mythic core, end quote, of fascism is predicated upon a vision of national restoration via a totalitarian sociopolitical system. This mythic core, furthermore, is expressed, quote, not only in theoretical writings, speeches, and propaganda, but also in the semiotic language of rallies, symbols, and uniforms, which is to say, quote, the whole style of its politics, end quote. Such an approach, Griffin contends, is flexible enough to account for specific national idiosyncrasies, such as the charismatic leader cult or the obsession with notions of genetic or racial health, while simultaneously anticipating the, quote, extensive ideological heterogeneity which exists between various manifestations, both within and beyond interwar Europe. Indeed, generic fascism is definable in Griffin's eyes precisely, quote, in terms of a cluster of values and goals, common to all its various permutations, end quote, rather than any one specific attitude, viewpoint, or policy. In responding to these debates with respect to generic fascism, Robert O. Paxton outlines a dynamic or multi-staged approach for outlining fascism's universally applicable qualities, tendencies, and objectives. Thank you. In his 1998 Journal of Modern History study, The 5 Stages of Fascism, likely an intentional allusion to the title of Nolte's foundational 1966 study, Paxton proposes a collection of historical strategies for interpreting fascistic movements and governments across both time and space. Since the, quote, words of fascist intellectuals correspond only distantly with what fascist movements do after they have power, end quote, Paxton correctly observes, scholars ought to examine the choices made by fascists in their daily actions, as opposed to getting bogged down in the contradictions that obscure every reading of fascist texts. To develop a generic description or universal model, scholars must analyze fascism in its daily operation or in motion, Paxton contends, quote, through its cycle of potential, though not inevitable stages, end quote. In total, Paxton proposes 5 stages of socio-political development for fascist movements. The first, or the initial, stage is the establishment of the movements themselves, while the second is their rooting as parties in a political system. The acquisition of power and the exercise of power, both of which, it should be noted, frequently take on contrastingly different forms and expressions, depending upon the national context, are Paxton's 3rd and 4th stages of fascism's development. Fascism's 5th and final stage is radicalization or entropy, during which fascist regimes either accelerate towards full radicalization, as did Nazi Germany in the lead up to and especially during World War II, or they devolve, like fascist Italy did, into what Paxton refers to as a quote-unquote routine authoritarianism. By the early 2000s, this second wave of scholarly enthusiasm for studying generic fascism had once again begun fizzling into historiographical obscurity. However, as scholarly interest in the question of universal fascism was waning, new historiographical turns began appearing on the horizon, which I'm contending in this presentation offer fascist studies opportunities for pushing the boundaries of our knowledge of fascisms beyond 20th century Europe, and equally as significant, pushing forward on identifying some form of a fascist minimum with, in contrast to previous proposals, the potential for a scholarly consensus. Thank you. During the last 20 or so years, scholars of fascism have begun widening our analytical lens by comparing the aesthetic strategies of ultranationalist populisms from as far afield as interwar Asia, Africa, and the Americas. And along with these path-breaking studies have come new historical questions and interpretive strategies. If fascism's origins were, contrary to the pronouncements of many first-wave historians of European fascisms, and I'm thinking of Allardyce here in particular, not singularly rooted in the horrors of industrial warfare during the First World War and the tumultuous aftermaths of demobilization and, in some cases, revolution, then what alternative approaches might be necessary for moving beyond these largely Eurocentric models for studying generic fascism, especially on a global scale? These questions and more are explored in Julia Adaney Thomas and Jeff Ely's 2020 anthology, Visualizing Fascism, the 20th Century Rise of the Global Right. Thank you. Based on 2 central themes, fascism as a global and as an aesthetic phenomenon, the studies in Visualizing Fascism propose to, quote-unquote, see fascism generically, according to the consistencies between different far-right aesthetic strategies across time and space, as opposed to what their followers believed, wrote down, or the idiosyncratic objectives they pursued. In departing from history's traditional emphasis upon the scholarly consultation of text-based archival materials, the essays in Visualizing Fascism investigate the ways in which extreme right-wing movements and governments in Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia deployed photography, graphic design, motion pictures, architecture, and monuments, among other topics and themes, as a common visual vocabulary for communicating with and as well as nationalizing and militarizing the masses within their respective contexts. In the anthology's introduction, Thomas articulates the theoretical framework for what she has aptly dubbed a quote-unquote portable definition of fascism, which travels across space and time and is useful in analyzing places where fascist movements failed, as well as places where fascist regimes were established. This portable definition of universal fascism, Thomas explains, is based upon 5 interrelated propositions. Thank you. Firstly, quote, fascism cannot be safely consigned to the past, end quote, and can therefore recur, quote, whenever people become alienated not only from the traditional right, but also from liberal democratic and left-wing alternatives, end quote. Fascism is the product of a political crisis in modern capitalist states, Thomas's second foundational principle contends, widening our analytical framework for thinking about the socio-political contexts of what might be referred to as a fascist impulse. Less dependent upon the collective traumas of industrial-scale warfare, Thomas's second principle encourages scholars to investigate the categorical contexts in which fascist movements have historically developed, including, but by no means limited to, incidents involving a perceived national humiliation, such as a major defeat on the battlefield, as was the case with Germany after 1918, the so-called mutilated victory of the First World War, which was Italy's case the following year, or in their homeland's prolonged entanglement with foreign imperial powers, which had been the case with China in the 1920s and 30s. And here I'm thinking of the blue shirts, a small fascist movement in 1920s, 30s China, as opposed to specific and nationally dependent events or processes which have not only contributed to and reinforced, which have only contributed to and reinforced scholarly disagreement with respect to the question of generic fascism. Thomas's third and fourth propositions contend that violence was oftentimes viewed by fascists as, quote, key to propelling the dissolution of civility and governability, end quote, which is more often than not pursued via the irrational appeal to popular emotions. The fifth and final proposition brings readers closer to the anthology's historiographical contributions. Quote, visual presentations of fascist ideology were crucial precisely because the message of the graphic arts, images, collages, movies, monuments, and pageantry was elusive and emotive, end quote. In distancing ourselves from the trappings of textual sources, which continuously point our scholarship back to specific regional and or nationalist contexts, the further study of palingenesis-oriented ultra-nationalist visual cultures, I am suggesting here, could very well help scholars of fascism better elucidate the underlying principles of what might be referred to as a common visual vocabulary between these seemingly disparate movements and governments. Beyond these examinations of far-right aesthetics, a growing number of scholars have begun moving beyond geopolitical boundaries by exploring fascism from a paradoxically enough transnational methodological perspective. Intended to problematize the nation-state complex as both a historically lived reality and, more pertinent for our purposes, a historiographical concept, transnationalism, in the words of Angel Alcalde, quote, focuses on transfers between countries and nations and cross-border exchanges and circulation of people and ideas, thereby exposing the interconnectedness of modern globalized society. Transnational history, I should say, quote, transnational history allows us to reflect on, while at the same time going beyond the confines of the nation, end quote. Patricia Clavin elaborates, adding that the cross-border macro-scale methodology, quote, sheds new comparative light on the strengths and the fragilities of the nation-state and underlines the ways in which local history can be understood in relation to broader forces in modern world history, end quote. Transnational history, however, should not be considered just a mere extension of a previous field, international history. Indeed, while the latter analyzes nation-states and nationalisms within their respective contexts, the former examines their porosity and their permeability, highlighting the networks of individuals, groups, and movements which crisscross between their respective borders, and shining a light on the significant contributions of multinational currents and influences in the quote-unquote making of nationalisms and nation-states, as well as in the making of social, cultural, political, and economic connectivities between the confines, or beyond the confines of national communities. This particular approach not only contributes to the provincialization of interwar European fascisms within the wider context of pursuing a more globally representative fascist minimum, which Thomas's and Ely's Visualizing Fascism anthology attempted to accomplish through visual studies, but it holds the potential for being combined with other analytical tools and approaches, including those associated with digital history, which I will be elaborating on here in the following section. In their 2016 monograph, Transnational Fascism in the 20th Century, Spain, Italy, and the Global Neo-Fascist Network, Matteo Albanese and Pablo Del Hierro explore the history of the global neo-fascist network which existed during the 1920s and the late Cold War years. Adopting a historical network approach, the co-authors examine the transnational connections not only between Spanish and Italian fascist circles, but also between these Southern European, I'm going to use the word nodes, that'll become important in the next section, to reference the methodological vocabulary of social network analysis, and various individuals and organizations in North and South America. In doing so, Albanese and Hierro show, quote, how this network became a crucial channel for communication, exchange of ideas, and even cooperation within the neo-fascist political field, end quote. One of the more glaring implications of applying a transnational methodological framework to studying fascism, of course, has to do with the ideology's nationalist foundations. While the vast majority of studies on the history of fascism rightly characterize the ideology's various manifestations as ultra-nationalist, the co-authors of Transnational Fascism in the 20th Century, building upon the insights of Andrea Mammone, contend that fascism, quote, cannot be fully understood without the transnational dimension, end quote. Indeed, by abandoning our adherence to historically established geopolitical boundaries within our respective studies, scholars can avoid falling victim to the, quote, exceptionalist parochialism, which so often characterizes the single country focus in fascist studies, while simultaneously avoiding the opposite trap of excessively general conceptual models, end quote. In pushing our perspectives beyond the exclusionary boundaries of nation-states, therefore, scholars of fascism might be able to better pinpoint the areas of ideological and programmatic overlap which brought these disparate movements and dictatorships together into collaboration, however loosely and informally, and thereby better identify the universal ideological impulses and values shared between them. Thank you. Lastly, let's turn briefly to the question of generic fascism and digital history. In the last 30 or so years, historians and scholars from various other humanities and social sciences disciplines have developed a whole suite of digital software and, with them, methodologies designed to help researchers identify macro-level associations, patterns, and connections within their respective subjects, which, due to the sheer scale of the information involved, would take years, if not decades, to sift through and comprehend in a systematic fashion, by individual researchers. Among the software and interpretive approaches worth mentioning here are text mining, topic modeling, and most importantly, social network analysis, which I'll abbreviate here as SNA. So due to my time constraints in this presentation, if you'd like to read the longer paper that's available, I do elaborate on text mining and topic modeling, but I'll be focusing exclusively on SNA in the following pages. At its core, SNA is based upon two categories of visually representable data, nodes and edges. Nodes, for our purposes, might be the individuals, groups, or ideas under examination, while the edges might be the relationships between these individuals, groups, or ideas. One of the strengths of SNA is its flexibility or its scalability. Using an SNA approach, researchers can develop small-scale models of historical networks representing the relationships between small groups of individuals, or large-scale models featuring hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of different individuals, groups, and their overlapping movements and governments. By visualizing these nodes and edges via software such as Gephi, which is the one that you see on the following, if you can change the slide, here we are, this is Gephi here. Gephi, Cytoscape, and the impossibly Byzantine software R. If you know anything about that, you know what I'm talking about. To name just a few of these, scholars can better identify the dominant individuals, groups, and organizations, as well as values, ideas, and objectives within the historical network under examination. By exploring, or rather incorporating, these types of approaches, scholars of fascism on both individual and collaborative scales might consider developing a large-scale open access database, or better yet, a series of interconnected databases featuring the most widely used words and phrases for individual movements and dictatorships, the associations between those topics and various other topics in the database, and in terms of visualizing fascisms in transnational perspective, the strongest as well as the weakest nodes and edges in the historical networks connecting these groups to a mythic core of shared concepts and practices. In developing an open access model of ultra-right-wing individuals, networks, and their ideas and values in these ways, and explicitly drawing upon the methodological approaches and historiographical insights of the previously discussed fields of visual studies and transnational history, I contend, historians might be able to lay the discursive foundations for a more globally representative, and therefore potentially more widely acceptable, description of generic fascism. Conclusion, thank you. All right, so in conclusion, in the last 30 or so years, back two, I think we need to go back two. It's not grazie yet. In the last 30 or so years, scholars of fascism have laid the methodological groundwork for the quote-unquote rebirth, if you will, of the scholarly pursuit of a working definition for generic or universal fascism. Increasingly unmoored from the Eurocentrism of first-wave scholarship and the conceptual limitations of the nation-state complex, historians of palingenetic ultranationalist populisms have developed a handful of interpretive approaches which, when combined, might serve as a platform for empirically connecting the classical far-right dictatorships in Europe with revolutionary ultranationalist movements and governments from as far afield as East Asia, Africa, and the Americas. As Roger Griffin has pointed out, fascism, generically speaking, is describable not in terms of a simple or stagnant collection of ideological ingredients, ranging from the authoritarian leader cult of interwar Europe's classical dictatorships, or to the militarization of society and politics, but rather in terms of a cluster of values and goals common to all the various permutations. These clusters, as I have suggested, could very well be studied and measured via a digital history approach, utilizing the computing power of text mining, topic modeling, and most importantly for its applicability with transnational history, social network analysis. By building up an open access database featuring the central ideas and stated objectives of various fascistic movements and governments, scholars would be able to closely examine the strongest nodes in this network connecting each of these far-right communities together, and thereby develop an empirically grounded collection of clusters of what might be labeled as generic fascist values and goals. Such a digital history approach, moreover, might also be well suited to taking Robert Paxton's observations regarding fascism's stages of development more seriously. As Paxton and others have pointed out, not all fascisms evolved from the initial stage of movement to a single-party rule, as Mussolini's and Hitler's regimes did. And given that fascism, at least in its Italian expression, tended historically to adjust its program in accordance with the available stepping stones of political opportunism, thereby changing their values and goals along the way. Such an open access database would naturally require and be capable of doing or implementing a temporally sensitive dimensionality in order to more accurately measure the commonalities shared between different fascisms across space, and most importantly for these purposes, time, that is, with respect to these stages of development. Perhaps there are still yet to be made observations about the ways in which fascists pursued power, either successfully or unsuccessfully, waiting for historians in such a digital history-aided research program. And yet, one might be left to wonder why really any of this matters. Why would historians want to develop a generic conception or description of fascism anyway? What advantage beyond the realm of scholarly curiosity and academic knowledge production does such a globally collaborative project offer? Since fascism, as we know, was not swept into the proverbial dustbin of history following the collapse of the Axis alliance in the Second World War, but rather was reborn via the various neo-fascist movements and political parties of the post-war years, such an open access research database system might also help scholars better elucidate the historical connections between classical fascisms and those of the Cold War and subsequent periods. Doing so, I argue, is not only necessary for expanding our knowledge of what fascism was, and to a great extent continues to be, but will also be an extremely useful resource in spotting fascistic movements as they form, and thereby combating the spread of fascism within our contemporary societies. Quote, one slide here. It is not enough to treat each national case individually. Good. It is not enough to treat each national case individually as if each one constitutes a category in itself, Paxton has correctly observed, adding that if historians are not able to develop a synthetic model for generic fascism, thereby paving the way for thinking more critically and widely about the potential forms fascism might take moving forward, quote, we risk being unable to understand this century or the next, end quote. And if we would like to both better understand the history of fascisms during the long 20th century and simultaneously enjoy the next 80 years of a global community largely free from the scourge of fascistic political cultures, then we must forge ahead on the path leading towards a universally applicable description of fascism. Now, I say grazie for your attention.
We're going to move immediately to questions from the audience, and we're going to take questions until 4:15.
Well, thanks very much for this, let us say, 3 overviews on the historiography of fascism. First a comment, then a question. The comment. Just by chance, before I came last week, I decided to do a very, it's more intuition, a research on who was the most quoted author in the community of fascist studies in the end of the 20th century. And curiously, in 1988, it was not Renzo De Felice, it was not Paxton yet, it was a conservative historian, as a matter of fact, a good friend and colleague of George Morse, called Stanley Payne. Because he was probably associated to the, let us say, to use Michel Daubry's, that was quoted by Calise, essentialist definition of fascism. Payne's vanished from the historiographical overviews, but his book, Fascism Comparative and Definition, was there, very much quoted by the community of historians working. So I think when we look at when we do an overview of the historiography of fascism, I think it's important to have, to look at this quantitative data. What was the authors, quoted between, let us say, De Felice and Griffin and other historians. The question I would like to ask is related with diffusion. Because I would like to because as, when you look at fascism in general and you do overviews, historiographical overviews of fascism, the main problem is we are talking about fascism as an ideology, we are talking about the era of fascism, we are talking about fascist regimes, and there is a contradiction that I think it's very difficult, to avoid when you look at the era of fascism and fascism in general, which is the contradiction between the revolutionary dimensions of fascist ideology and some fascist regimes, in this case, Italy and Germany, and the fact that the era of fascism, the most important diffusion elements of fascism in the 1930s were related to fascist institutions. The reason why Japan, Thailand, Vargas in Brazil look at Italian fascism was not because of fascist movements, but because of corporatism, but because of the single party, but because of nationalism, and because the relation between state and civil society, because in a way of political institutions. So the question is basically, in your opinion, how do we solve this contradiction between, the floating dimensions of fascist ideology and fascism as a political regime?
It should be okay. Thank you very much for the question. Presumably you are referring to Wayland's point in that respect, that, what does get diffused, it's a horrible... Sorry?
Not very much quoted by historians.
No, absolutely. This kind of, the word diffusion being a bit ugly in this process, but the idea that when we talk about the success of interwar fascism, we're not talking about the success so much of radical movements and their ideologies, as we can talk about what fascism is and so on, but this kind of authoritarian innovations, this idea. Of course, it's a contradiction in the sense that the way in which these two different perceptions of traveling fascism, let's put it like this, I know that's another horrible term, have very different effects and very different motivations in many ways. Absolutely, I agree with regard to this. But then again, they're not exactly divorced. So in many ways, the people who are, to use an example of an institution, the fascist youth model, which was probably the most successful such institution in the, in terms of appeal, in terms of transnational and international spread. What's happening in that case is that the people who are adopting this institution are making an active choice. The local agents are making an active choice to reject the revolutionary, into inverted commas, radical aspects of the movement, the mass character and so on and so forth, and engage with, not imitate, I try to make this point, but engage with inspiring political innovation. So I think ideology is there, and in some cases, yes, ideological revolutionary currents can be traced, if you like. But this is only a very small part of the transnational history of mobile fascism, let's put it in that respect. So there is a contradiction, but I don't think we can understand the diffusion of authoritarian institutions, authoritarian fascist, whatever institutions, without understanding and analyzing the active choices that local agents make vis-a-vis fascist ideology and fascist institution, whether these involve adoption, into inverted commas, or translation, or indeed rejection, making a choice not to have a mass political party, making a choice not to do this. So that's how I would say. So it is a contradiction, but it's not entirely a contradiction that needs to be resolved.
I wanted to say, yes, about Pent, you are right. It's an important author and historian. Even if you, as I said in my paper, I am writing a history of fascism, all fascism. And I saw the book of Payne, but Payne does not really write a real comparative history of fascism. He talked about Italy and Germany and Francoism, and it's not a complexive history of fascism, even it's very important. I think the tentative of real history of fascism are very few. You have Colotti, for example. Colotti tried really to compare and to to compare, and it's important. I wanted to say another thing. Writing this book, I have forged my own definition, because as you said, it's really very own with fascist movement, fascist regime, the small movement, etc. And I would like to read this definition, and if someone wants to, how do we say, if you want to destroy it, it will be very useful for me. So the definition, because I think it's difficult to speak in a book of 500 pages about fascism without an initial definition. Mine is that it's not revolutionary, you can imagine. Ultra-nationalist movement or political system opposed to enlightenment, liberalism, and communism, which aims to transform society and the individual on the basis of a holistic conception of society through single party and or state dictatorship and violence. I think it's less complete in confront to Emilio Gentile's definition, which is very, very precise. But for me, it was a useful tool, to speak after of fascism. It's my way of answer to you.
Yeah, I'll comment only on the on your comment on Payne with respect to his role within this field. He appears in my my longer paper. I decided not to go through all of the different permutations of generic fascist studies to date. But in terms, I mean, he's a prolific scholar in our field, of course, of Spanish fascism, and I believe of French fascism as well, and has contributed disproportionately in terms of the number of publications to generic fascist studies. But in terms of moving forward, in my eyes, his approach has been, I think, a bit more of a taxonomic one, which is composed of lists and bullet points and things that are largely static conceptions, which I think has been, if I can be so bold to admit, a bit of a failed project, and not, probably won't be included in any version of generic fascist studies moving forward, which I think, as Aristotle rightly pointed out, must be dynamic and inflexible, right, and not a sort of static list of unchanging atemporal factors.
Yes, I just wanted to make a brief comment and then maybe a question. What is great, I mean, one of the great things about doing in a conference like this is that we can see how the field is evolving, and for those of us, we have been in previous conferences, well, for many years. Like, to me, what Antonio said is striking, that Payne is not part of the presentation, because, when I started in the 1990s, he was. And then, I mean, perhaps, in my opinion, more importantly, in the sense that, in my opinion, I'm being very normative here, he shouldn't be an absence in these discussions, is the work of Seb Sternhell. Because Seb Sternhell, because I don't know, it depends on a lot of things, subject positions and context where we approach fascism in the first place. But for people studying fascism in Latin America, that is my case. Seb Sternhell was, and I think still is, a key author when analyzing fascism. In the US or in other contexts where perhaps people are lazy, they don't want to read in other languages, I mean, there is something about, some historians becoming more of a canonic figure rather than others. But I think we are serious about this. Sternhell needs to be part of the discussion. And here, what is interesting, and I think, this emphasis on diffusion, transnational, obviously for me, I'm biased in that regard, and trying to go beyond fixating on what fascism is, goes back to why many of us, and certainly that is my case, started doing this. And in my case, it was a problem with generic fascism in the sense of, these approaches that wanted to, rather than to fixate, to provide an essence, and then for the rest of us to be working bees, studying different cases, following the master definition of some self-described masters. And that's how it all began. And I think in the last 20 years, what many people did is going back to the fascists and starting to read them again and see what they are saying about what is fascism, whether there is something about fascism that goes beyond Europe, and so on and so forth. And here, and this is my comment, and I'm realizing, well, I have a small question. I will finish in 1 minute. My comment is that here is what Moses' limits are at the same time that are typical of a previous context. They are also perhaps providing a challenge for the rest of us. Because it's clear that I mean, I will not be polite. It's clear that in Moses' case, I mean, there is a strong Eurocentrism that is very frustrating for people that study fascism outside Europe. On the other hand, I have to confess that when I started working on fascism in the 1990s, and I was not alone, it was the work of Moses that helped me a lot in trying to see and actually seeing things in Latin America that he was observing for Europe. I mean, and this is the paradox, I think, that his work is still important despite these more contextual limitations, which is this fixation on, this Eurocentric kind of take. And in that sense, and this is interestingly the case, that he was not very much translated into Spanish. And in Latin America, many people access Moses through Italian translations because many people do not read English as well as Italian. And my question is about Gino Germani, because I always had the feeling, and perhaps experts on Moses can can illuminate a little bit. I mean, that Germany should, in my opinion, be part of the conversations. And there are strong links between this kind of triangle between De Felice, Mose, and Germani. And Germani being Italian, Argentine, I mean, he's not as read as other key authors, in my opinion. But perhaps if you wanted to comment on Germani, I would appreciate it. That's my question.
No, so about Germany, I agree with you. I think it was important, and the link. There are a lot of names of historians: Paine, Germany. We could talk about Pierre Milza too, which book about fascism was very important, and the link between De Felice and Germany must be noted. So, okay, I agree with this reflection. I think that the works of historians are forgotten very quickly. I think it's a lesson we can take about our discussion, and questo ci rende molto umili.
We can take one final question, but it has to be brief. Why don't we take a question over on this side?
Thank you. Hello, thank you for some brilliant papers. I have a question for Brian. When you were speaking, and I really like this idea of proposing visual, transnational, and digital kind of methodologies, and it made me think, what would happen if we kind of brought all of those three things together and thought about like meme culture and the far right and what's going on there kind of in online spaces, which is of course inherently transnational. And I wondered if you could speak a bit to that, the kinds of things you would expect to see as the shared online transnational visual culture today.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, the expert in the room is Jennifer Evans, because she's written a book recently with Megan Lundrigan on tracking, Jen, remind me, online Holocaust denial. Is this the kind of general, yeah. And looking at Facebook, Twitter, and all kinds of social media data and using these kind of like large database approaches. I think, did you guys use Gephi for that that project? Yeah. And I know of at least one other researcher who worked with Jen and I on the New Fascism syllabus to write a kind of a really brief article on the, I don't know if you guys remember this, but years ago in Wisconsin, there was this controversy over a high school prom photo where the boys in their tuxedos were seen delivering a fascist salute, and it was not entirely clear as to who had encouraged them to do that, but that entered the social media space. And then I can't remember Wademan Bjorn, I think, was the one who wrote this. He used Gephi to kind of track the movement of that image across social media space. And so I do think that that's kind of an emerging approach. And I certainly think that far-right memes, including, what is this, Pepe the Frog, right? Which that's largely kind of an alt-right thing that's begun to fizzle down. But I certainly think that this is an approach that could be used for that. And there are good examples to follow out there.
For those of you who are not able to join us for the screening of War Game last night, a film by Tony Gerber, the war game that they play out uses exactly that kind of tracking in order to simulate different kinds of emergency scenarios should there be another takeover of the January 6th type. So it is not only being used by economists, not only being used by historians, but also being used, of course, by the military now in order to simulate different scenarios and our responses to it. So I think there's a lot to learn and a lot to fear as well. So we're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we will come back at 4:30. So thank you very much.
it to? It does eight.
To the PowerPoint.
Do you have a PowerPoint?
I sent a PowerPoint.
I have no PowerPoint from you. I don't.
Do you really have one?
There
I
was
sent
dear
a
God.
upload. Okay.
but
Where
so
is it?
No, it's possible.
it doesn't.
Quickly, let's find it. Where is it? Where is
have
your
it?
phone?
I sent it to you, but I can't.
And it's, you know that's not, you know you're going to receive it.
Sure, I don't.
We still have 5 minutes here. Here we go.
You have it?
Is well, but you will come up.
It's okay.
We're figuring it out. They're not sitting down. Let's do it. Let's do it. He has a PowerPoint. Who knew? Ah, he thought he sent it. This guy would know whether it was. Let's see if it works. I like you very analog. Yeah? Yeah, yeah. What happened to you now? See here? I don't see him anymore. Oh yeah, he's in the background. I think we're just resolving some technical issues and uploading a PowerPoint, so I think we're okay. Is it working? Sky coming forward? Yes, we have Enzo. We have our presenter. Okay. All right, welcome everybody to Fascism as Modernity. And Sky can correct me if I got this wrong, but I think this is a 2-hour session. And after that, we get to go out over there again and enjoy food and drinks. And then at 8:30, we must be down the hill, as it were, in order to catch our ride back. Yes, I got it? I got the facts. Okay. So here we go. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and the PowerPoint is there. It's working. Yeah. Great. Yes. Is it work? It is working. But everybody got that about the 2 hours, the food, and the bus down the hill at 8:30. Okay. Yes. Enzo Traverso is the Susan and Barton Winocour Professor in the Humanities at Cornell University. His research focuses on the intellectual history of the 19th and 20th century. Born in Italy, studied history at the University of Genoa, received his PhD from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris in 1989. And before coming to Cornell, he taught political science for 20 years at the University of Picardy in France. He's been a visiting professor at many European and Latin American universities, authored many books, which are translated into more than 15 languages, including The Jewish Question, History of a Marxist Debate, and The Jews in Germany from the Judeo-German Symbiosis to the Memory of Auschwitz, The Origins of Nazi Violence, The End of Jewish Modernity, and the way I feel right now, left-wing melancholia. Take it away.
Thank you for inviting me, for giving me the opportunity to participate in this wonderful and extremely interesting conference, and giving me the opportunity to participate in this debate. So with my paper, I will shift to the present, trying to find a connection between our historiographical debates and the present situation. So there are different ways to read the proceedings of the seminar held at Stanford in the fall of 1963. Historians of fascism can find there a fascinating archival source for exploring George Moss's workshop, 1 year before the publication of his first great book on fascism, The Crisis of German Ideology. A second approach, which is the purpose, I think, of, or at least one of the purposes of this symposium, and which I will adopt in my paper, in my presentation, consists in renewing the same exercise 6 decades later, when a new post-fascist wave is rising dramatically on a global scale. In this case, the Stanford debates of 1963 can become a useful landmark for thinking historically about the present. When the Stanford seminar took place, fascism belonged to a recent past, but nonetheless, it was a bygone experience. Of course, no one could exclude its return under new forms, in new historical circumstances, but talking about fascism meant talking about the past. The Second World War was the watershed that clearly separated fascism from the time of their discussion. The only allusion to the post-war years was made by Mosse himself, who asked his interlocutors whether McCarthyism could be considered a form of fascism. Like them, he expressed his skepticism. In his view, fascism couldn't be reduced to anti-communism, and McCarthyism didn't possess the positive traits of fascism. To be fascist, Mosse pointed out, you need more than merely to be against. The discussion didn't go further. By 1963, McCarthyism itself belonged to the past, viewed more as an ephemeral ulceration of the Cold War than as a serious attempt to destroy democracy. The scholars who attended that seminar at Stanford, many of them European exiles, believed in the solidity of American democracy. Today, their optimism has been shaken. The question discussed in 1963 no longer appear as a pure the questions discussed in 1963 no longer appear as a purely historiographical topic. We cannot put the question, what is fascism, without thinking about the reality surrounding us. In 2025, this question is not exclusively about the past, but also and above all about the present. A present shaped by the dramatic rise of the far right worldwide. In the US, there is a debate about Trump's fascism. In Italy, the chief of government is a proud heir of Mussolini's fascism. In France, a movement created 50 years ago by 2 Waffen SS is at the edge of power. Far-right movements participate in several government coalitions of the European Union, and similar tendencies are rising in Latin America, from Argentina to Brazil. There is a debate on the fascist features of Putin's Russia, Modi's India, and Erdogan's Turkey. This international context inevitably prompts us to think historically about the present. Are we becoming back to the 1930s? Does the concept of fascism capture the novelty of our situation? As Reinhard Koselleck pointed out, there is a tension between historical facts and their linguistic transcription. Concepts are indispensable to think a particular historical experience, but they can also transcend it and be used to apprehend new realities which are connected to the past through a web of memorial continuity. Historical comparison, fascism is one of their privileged realms, cannot avoid this tension between history and language. They can be fruitful, but they establish analogies and differences rather than homologies and repetitions. Sometimes they reveal that old concepts no longer work and should be renewed. Today, this entanglement between past and present displays an ambiguous semantics. For sure, most radical right parties and movements don't endorse fascism and, with few exceptions, don't claim the legacy of their ancestors of the 1930s and 1940s. But their comparison with fascism cannot be avoided nonetheless. In short, the concept of fascism seems both inappropriate and indispensable for grasping this new reality. This is why I prefer to speak of post-fascism, a definition that emphasizes a chronological distance and locates what is happening today in a historical sequence shaped by both continuity and transformation. Chronologically, this right-wing constellation comes after classical fascism and belongs to a different historical context. At the same time, it cannot be defined without being compared to fascism, which remains a foundational experience. On the one hand, it is no longer fascism. On the other, it's not completely different. It is something in between. The concept of post-fascism certainly doesn't answer all open questions, but corresponds to this transitional step. We should not forget that the category of fascism has been frequently used after the Second World War. In 1959, Theodor Adorno wrote that, I quote, "the survival of National Socialism within democracy was potentially more dangerous than the survival of fascist tendencies against democracy." In 1974, Pierpaolo Pasolini depicted the anthropological models of neoliberalism, at that time still embryonic, as a new fascism in front of which the regime of Mussolini appeared irremediably archaic, as a kind of paleofascism. With similar arguments, Umberto Eco depicted Mussolini's regime as war-fascism. Several years ago, many historians stressed that Berlusconi's plebiscitary conception of democracy and charismatic leadership strongly evoked the fascist archetype. Today, Berlusconi has become a modest forerunner of Donald Trump. In other words, fascism is not only transnational, like we saw in the previous session, or transatlantic, according to Federico Finkelstein, but also transhistorical. It is collective memory that establishes a link between a concept and its public use, which inevitably exceeds a purely historiographical dimension. In fact, it is true for many of the concepts of our political lexicon. Saying that the United States, the Federal Republic of Germany, and France are democracies doesn't mean to posit the identity of their political systems, neither to pretend that they would correspond to the Athenian democracy of Pericles' age. In the 21st century, fascism will neither take the face of Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco, nor, hopefully, the form of the totalitarian terror, but there are multiple ways to destroy democracy. Today, many commentators interpret Donald Trump as a fascist meteor that suddenly and unexpectedly fell on the American democracy. They seem to forget that democracy can be destroyed from within. Donald Trump is a pure product of the American society and the US political system. Post-fascism blurs the conventional boundary separating fascism from democracy. So, in this paper, I will try to analyze the present situation by reformulating some question raised by the Stanford debates and, more broadly speaking, by George Moss's interpretation of fascism. I apologize if this approach seems or can seem a little bit academic. So the biggest discrepancies that deserve to be mentioned are violence and anti-communism. In 1963, Mosse viewed National Socialism as an outcome of the Völkisch ideology, a form of nationalism that put down deep roots into German culture much before the First World War. Subsequently, he nuanced his approach by emphasizing the genetic link of fascism with the brutalization of continental Europe during the Great War, a trauma that transformed the political language and practices. Today, most radical right leaders are accustomed to appearing on our television screens, and their followers don't march dressed in uniform. Violence, think of the assault on the Capitol on January 6, 2021, or the Brazilian Congress attack 2 years later, is the exception, not the rule. In Western countries, post-fascism has emerged after 70 years of peace, and generally it accepts the institutional framework of liberal democracy. The West has exported violence beyond its borders, mainly to Asia and the Middle East, and is accustomed to presenting one of its creators, terrorism, as an external threat. The second relevant issue that emerged in the Stanford seminar was anti-communism. And once again, this was not sufficient, according to Mosse, to define fascism. Anti-communism was the matrix of McCarthyism, which, he pointed out, was not fascism. Today, anti-communism belongs to the ideological and political background of post-fascism, but it is certainly not a central component of its rhetoric and propaganda. Of course, an electoral confrontation between Donald Trump and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or between Marine Le Pen and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, could reactivate in the future this subjacent epistemic foundation of post-fascism. Several decades after the end of the Cold War, however, anti-communism was put behind the stage. This change has some considerable consequences. A powerful boundary that once separated fascism from the laboring classes no longer exists. if you can put the... Thus, Le Pen, Salvini, Orban, Milei, and Trump have reintegrated the working class into their nationalist imagination. Of course, they refer to a national working class without immigrants, mostly composed of white men, but they pretend to defend them against globalization and claim a kind of ethnically circumscribed welfare state. In a historical perspective, post-fascism could also be seen as a result of the defeat of the revolutions of the 20th century. After the collapse of communism and the embrace of neoliberal reason by most social democratic parties, radical right movements have become, in many countries, the most influential forces opposed to the establishment without showing a subversive face and avoiding any competition with a demobilized left. This change is far from being anecdotal. In the 1930s, fascism was unable to conquer the laboring classes, which remained pervaded by a socialist culture and organized by left-wing parties and unions. A solid wall separated their values, identities, and languages from those of fascism. They expressed different rituals and symbols. When it came to power, fascism could not integrate the labor movement into its own social and political system. It was compelled to destroy it. Today, this cleavage has disappeared. In many European countries, the former bastions of the left have become, with a spectacular reversal of the traditional electoral landscape, the strongholds of far-right parties. We can also put no, the previous one. Yeah. Marine Le Pen. Okay, the first one was. So the radical right claims the classic populist paradigm of the good people opposed to the corrupted elites, but it reformulated it. In the past, the good people meant an ethnically homogeneous community, sometimes portrayed with strong roots in the soil, opposed to the dangerous classes of the big cities. After the end of communism, a defeated working class struck by deindustrialization has been reintegrated in this virtuous national community. The bad people of post-fascist imagination, immigrants, Muslims, and blacks of the suburbs, veiled women, junkies, and marginal men, merge with the leisure classes, not necessarily very wealthy, but the leisure classes that adopt liberated customs, bohemians, feminists, LGBTQ, anti-racists, ecologists, and defenders of immigrant rights. On the opposite spectrum, the good people are nationalist, anti-feminist, homophobic, xenophobic, and nourish a clear hostility toward ecology, modern arts, and intellectualism. As Michel Fer has pertinently suggested, the continuity between early modern nationalism, fascism, and post-fascism lies in a persistent imaginary dichotomy between producers on the one hand and parasites on the other hand. The former virtuous laboring men and women shamefully exploited by the latter, an heterogeneous very heterogeneous group, including both the financial elites and immigrants benefiting from social security and welfare services in their host countries. According to Mosse, a second point now. According to Mosse, fascism was a revolution. This is one of the topics of our previous session. At the Stanford seminar, he vigorously asserted this idea, which he will elaborate in his following works. Now, this seems to me a crucial discrepancy between classical fascism and contemporary radical rights. What they lack is an idea of futurity. They don't claim any utopia. They are unable to project themselves into the future. Post-fascism belongs to a post-ideological age shaped by the collapse of the hopes of the 20th century, and it doesn't break a new regime of historicity, presentism, which, speaking with Reinhard Koselleck, is deprived of any horizon of expectation. In the 1930s, fascism claimed a national revolution and depicted itself as an alternative civilization opposed to both liberalism and communism. It announced the birth of a new man who would have regenerated the continent by replacing the old and decadent democracies. On the contrary, post-fascism doesn't have utopian ambitions. Its modernity lies in the means of its propaganda. All its leaders are very familiar with television, advertising, and communication. Rather than in its project, which is deeply conservative, against the enemies of civilization, it has globalization, immigration, Islam, terrorism, gender theories, and the radical right only claims a return to the past, national sovereignty, national preference, stopping immigration, the preservation of the Christian roots of Western countries, Europe in particular, gender hierarchies, defense of family, and so on and so on. From this point of view, the new radical right is more neoconservative than fascist. It belongs to the tradition of cultural despair, the Kulturpessimismus, described by Fritz Stern in, I think, 1961 work with this title, rather than to that of conservative revolution or reactionary modernism, which projected aristocratic and anti-democratic values into a future political order, a peculiar mix of obscurantism and technological modernity. Think of the ideologue of Alternative für Deutschland, Rolf Peter Zieferle. He wrote a dark pamphlet in which he complained about the decadence of Germany, dominated by cosmopolitan and post-national values. It has completely reshaped by Habermas' idea of Verfassung Patriotism, of constitutional patriotism. After publishing his intellectual testament, Finis Germania, in 2017, he committed suicide. So, in short, this is not the trajectory of a redeemer. It is far more reminiscent of the resigned discourse on decadence developed by Arthur Gobineau in 19th century France, or Oswald Spengler in early 20th century Germany, than of the modern call for revenge and regeneration embodied by Moritz Barrès, Benito Mussolini, and Ernst Jünger. post-fascist leaders don't share the same language and slogans with the thinkers of nationalisme intégral, total state, total mobilization, the aristocracy of the trenches, la trincherocrazia of Mussolini, and new militiamen, der Arbeiter, Junge, and so on and so on. The anti-modernism lacks the tendency to aestheticize politics, speaking with Benjamin, of classical fascism. In fact, there is a striking symmetry between the lack of futurity in both post-fascist and radical left culture. The eclipse of the myth of a 1,000-year Reich, or the myth of the rebirth of the Roman Empire, corresponds with the end of the socialist utopia. There is no equivalent today to the competition between Bolshevism and fascism to conquer the future. This competition, which according to Ernst Bloch took place in the unconscious and the dreams of the masses, belongs to the first half of the past century. Post-fascism fills the vacuum left by a disappeared horizon of expectation with a reactionary retreat into the past. Even MAGA, so Make America Great Again, Donald Trump's most effective and for his followers most exciting slogan, fails to portray the future of anything other than a return to the golden age of American power and prosperity. It is true that the alliance between Donald Trump and Elon Musk and other billionaires sketches the profile of a new, frightening, reactionary modernism merging conservative values and technological futurity. But till now, this remains a symptom of the reconciliation between fascism and the economic elites, rather than a symptom of the birth of a new fascist revolution. Well, a common feature of the radical right is xenophobia. The hatred of immigrants shapes the ideology and inspires their action. It transforms immigrants into infiltrated enemies, foreign bodies that threat the health of a national community. Post-fascism rejects cultural pluralism in the name of monolithic identities and disclaims cultural, racial, and religious pluralism. It transforms Georg Simmel's image of the stranger into Carl Schmitt's figure of the enemy. The search for a scapegoat is a constitutive element of fascist discourse, of course, and post-fascism doesn't divert from this path, but it is an innovator more than a follower. The main target of its hate is no longer the Jews, rather the Muslims. This shift from anti-Semitism to Islamophobia is a significant change that deserves to be analyzed. At the Stanford seminar, no one could have imagined such a metamorphosis. Fascism was strongly anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism shaped the entire worldview of German National Socialism and deeply affected the varieties of French radical nationalisms. It was introduced in the laws of Italian fascism in 1938, and even in Spain, where the Jews had been expelled at the end of the 15th century, Franco's propaganda identified them with los rojos, the Reds, as both enemies of national Catholicism. Of course, in the first half of the 20th century, anti-Semitism was widespread almost everywhere, from the aristocratic and bourgeois layers, where it established symbolic boundaries, to the intelligentsia. Many of the most red riders of the 1920s and 1930s didn't hide their hatred of the Jews. Today, however, Muslim immigrants have replaced the Jews in racist discourse. Racialism, a doctrine based on biological theories, has been replaced by a cultural prejudice that emphasizes an irreducible discrepancy between Jewish Christian Europe and Islam. Traditional anti-Semitism has not disappeared, of course. Periodic neo-Nazi attacks against the synagogues and Jewish schools in both Europe and the United States prove its persistence, but has become a residual phenomenon or has transmigrated from the far right to Islamic fundamentalism. As in a system of communicating vessels, pre-war anti-Semitism declined and Islamophobia increased. In fact, there is a certain continuity in this cultural transfer. The post-fascist representation of the enemy reproduces the old racial paradigm, and like the former Jewish Bolshevik, the Islamic terrorist is often depicted with physical threats, stressing his otherness. In one century, the intellectual ambition of the radical right has significantly diminished. Nowadays, there is no equivalent of La France juive by Édouard Drummond, or The Foundation of the 19th Century by Houston Stewart Chamberlain, nor the essays on racial anthropology by Hans Günther of the 1930s. The new nationalism has not produced writers like Giovanni Papini, Ernst Junger, Louis-Ferdinand Céline, and Pierre Drieux-La Rochelle, not to speak of thinkers like Giovanni Gentile, Martin Heidegger, and Carl Schmitt. The cultural humus of post-fascism is not nourished with literary creation, rather with a massive campaign to win media attention. Many political and intellectual personalities, television channels, and popular magazines that cannot be qualified as fascist have contributed to building this cultural humus. We could remember the inflamed prose of Oriana Fallaci on the Muslims who reproduce themselves like rats, and urinate against the walls of our beautiful cathedrals. Yeah. George Mosse had pointed out that in classical fascism, spoken words were more important than written texts. In an age in which the culture of words and images channeled by television and the social media has replaced textuality, it is not astonishing that the post-fascist discourse spreads first through the media, assigning a secondary place to literary productions. However, we might observe many similarities between today's Islamophobia and fin de siècle anti-Semitism in a pre-fascist era. The most significant comparison is with Wilhelmine Germany, not with the French Third Republic, even less with Italy, pre-fascist Italy. At the time of the Dreyfus affair, the Jews were designated as a state within the state, a position that certainly doesn't correspond to the present situation of the Muslim minorities, which remain hugely underrepresented inside the institutions of the European Union, for instance. Thus, the comparison would be more pertinent with Wilhelmine Germany, where the Jews were excluded from the state machine, just as the newspapers warned against a Jewish invasion, Verjudung. You can put the image. That was putting into question the no, even, yeah. That was putting into question the ethnic and religious basis of the Reich. According to Shulamit Volkov, anti-Semitism played the role of a cultural code that allowed the Germans to negatively define a national consciousness in a country torn by rapid modernization and urbanization, where the Jews appeared as its most dynamic group. In other words, a German was first non-Jewish. In a similar way, today Islam is becoming a cultural code that allows Europeans to find by a negative demarcation their lost national identity threatened or engulfed in the process of globalization. Sometimes anti-Semitism and Islamophobia coexist in the post-fascist discourse as two complementary rhetorical figures. The most striking case of this combination is found with Viktor Orban. You can, yeah. The chief of the Hungarian government, who denounces a double threat: a financial conspiracy organized by a parasitic Jewish elite from Wall Street. The usual target of his speeches is the banker George Soros, and a demographic threat embodied by mass immigration, Islamic invasion. While less explicit than Orban, similar arguments are often suggested by other far-right leaders of Central and Western Europe. But we should not neglect the multiple contradictions of such xenophobic rhetoric. Orban, as well as Trump and other far-right, European far-right leaders, has a very good relationship with Israel, which he considers as a powerful anti-Islamic bastion. Think of Matteo Salvini, one of the leaders of Italian radical right, who became internationally famous when, as a Ministry of Interior, he impeded ONG ships of refugees from reaching the shores of Sicily. In 2020, over the course of just 1 week, he both participated in mass meetings against immigrants and organized a conference against anti-Semitism in Rome, in which with the Israeli ambassador as a distinguished guest. In France, the myth of Islamic invasion was first formulated as a literary trope that quickly turned into a slogan, the Great Replacement. Le Grand Remplacement. The inventor of this figure of speech, the Islamization of France, is Renaud Camus, a writer who doesn't hide his closeness with the National Rally, the Rassemblement National, 20 years ago, he complained in his journal about the overwhelming Jewish presence in the French cultural media. In the following years, he shifted his focus to the Muslims, the actors of the Great Replacement. Camus belongs to the old school of French conservatives. He complains, so his complaint about the disappearance of eternal friends, la France éternelle, has the anguished taste of Léon Blois' pamphlets. The most popular advocates of the theory of the Great Replacement, however, are two public intellectuals, Éric Zemmour and Alain Finkielkraut. Zemmour has devoted to this topic a very successful book titled The French Suicide. Finkielkraut is the author of another bestseller, L'identité malheureuse, The Unhappy Identity, in which he depicts the despair of a great nation threatened by two calamities, multiculturalism on the one hand and a mistakenly idealized hybridity, the French melting pot, le métissage of a France, black, blanc, beurre, black, white, and Maghrebian. A national image that became very popular after the French victory of the Football World Cup in 1998. Put in a historical perspective, the myth of the Great Replacement reveals some astonishing affinities with a classic anti-Semitic stereotypes. This discourse doesn't differ very much from that of German nationalism at the end of the 19th century. In 1880, Heinrich von Treitschke, the most respected German historian of his time, deplored the intrusion, Einbruch, of the Jews into German society, where they shook the customs of Kultur and acted as a corruptive element. Treitschke's conclusion was a note of despair that became a kind of slogan. The Jews are our unhappiness. Die Juden sind unser Unglück. In fact, Finkielkraut's and Treitschke's unhappiness have the same roots, a similar discontent in the face of modernization and globalization combined with a nostalgic idealization of the past and the search for a scapegoat. In the US, the idea of the Great Replacement joins Donald Trump's slogan, America First, which, like its French homologue, has an interesting genealogy. Until the First World War, America First was the mantra of isolationism. It evoked a spirit of selfishness and the conviction that national interests should be defended regardless of any external circumstances. But the Great War was a turning point. Since the early 1920s, this catchword took a different meaning, until it condensed the claims of a new nativism that, according to many contemporaries, expressed the feature of a possible American fascism. Pushed forward by the anti-Bolshevik Red Scare and the rise of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, which reached at that time its highest influence, America First was reinterpreted in terms of biological races. The United States had to protect itself from mass immigration, an external threat coming from Southern and Eastern Europe that was modifying the biological basis of its civilization. Italian, Polish, and Balkan peasants as well as Eastern Jews, were destroying Nordicism, the pillar of traditional WASP America. The US equivalents of Chamberlain, Drummond, Barrès, and Maurras were the eugenicists Madison Grant, the author of The Passing of the Great Race in 1916, and Lothrop Stoddard's The Rising of Color Against White World Supremacy, 1920. So both of them announced a future of decadence for a nation that, because of immigration, could not remain a homogeneous population of Nordic blood. This huge campaign resulted in the National Origins Act of 1924, enthusiastically supported by the KKK, that reduced I have 5 minutes more. That reduced immigration by more than 80% by fixing national quotas. In the age of the New Deal, this wave of racist nativism declined until its spectacular comeback with Donald Trump. Thus, it is not very difficult to sketch the historical background of these speeches, of his speeches against Latino and Muslim immigrants, and so on. Like 1 century earlier, stopping immigration has become a matter of life and death for America, the condition to make America great again. But one point seems to me very important. Islamophobia is not a simple ersatz for old anti-Semitism, insofar as its roots are old and it possesses its own tradition, which is colonialism. In Europe, colonialism had invented a political anthropology based on the dichotomy between citizens and colonial subjects. In French, the legal categories of citoyen and indigène that fixed the social, spatial, racial, and political boundaries. In Italy, the separation between white and black people in the newly proclaimed empire was one of the purposes of the racial laws of 1938, which were not exclusively anti-Semitic. This colonialist legacy is probably one of the most significant links between fascism and post-fascism that cannot be apprehended through Mosse's hermeneutic dispositive. As I pointed out in several texts, the lack of any reflection on colonialism is probably the major weakness of Mosse's theory of fascism. But it seems to me that this colonial matrix of Islamophobia gives us a key for understanding the ideological metamorphosis of post-fascism, which has abandoned the imperial and conquering ambitions of classical fascism to adopt a much more conservative and defensive posture. It doesn't wish to conquer, rather to expel. Maybe we can come back to this point in our discussion. In one interesting intervention during the Stanford seminar, Moss emphasized that a Nazi, I quote, might have been more at home in an English public school than he would have been in Weimar Germany. In other words, the fascist idea of virility and respectability didn't differ significantly from Victorian Puritanism and a bourgeois conception of normalcy and decency, which in Germany was usually summarized by the term of Sittlichkeit. This is entirely consistent with the neoconservative and post-fascist contempt for gays, lesbians, and more broadly, queer culture, and as eloquently demonstrated in 2013 by the huge French demonstrations against the gay marriage, La Manif pour tous. However, the post-fascist view of sexuality is much more complex than the stigmatization of counter-models and the search for scapegoats. Despite its neoconservative character, post-fascism is full of contradictions and should not be interpreted as a simple return to, I don't know, Joseph de Maistre or Victorianism. Emerging within the consolidated institutional frameworks of liberal democracy in market societies, shaped by individualism, so forged by possessive individualism, post-fascism has broken with the fascist ideal type and in many cases claims the legacy of the Enlightenment. In the post-totalitarian age of human rights, this gives it respectability. Post-fascism doesn't justify its war against Islam with the old, today no longer acceptable arguments of imperial expansionism and doctrinal racialism, but rather with its own interpretation of the legacy of the Enlightenment. Marine Le Pen and Giorgia Meloni wanted to defend the French and Italians against immigrants, but they also pretend to defend women against Islamic obscurantism. Homophobia and gay-friendly Islamophobia coexist in this changing radical right. In the Netherlands, feminism and gay rights have been the flags of a violent xenophobic campaign against immigration and Muslims, led first by Pim Fortuyn and then by his successor Geert Wilders. Alice Weidel, a national leader of Alternative für Deutschland, is a lesbian who defends the traditional family. So today the legacy of Enlightenment is often reframed in a new version of Orientalism based on a dichotomic worldview that pits civilization, rationality, progress, and freedom against barbarism, fanaticism, and obscurantism. I will skip the last point. So related to the new connection, but post-fascism and the global elites of nowadays. But in conclusion, considering fascism as a transhistorical concept doesn't mean positing the eternal character, its eternal character, or envisaging its repetition. In the 21st century, it can only appear under a new form, and as I indicated at the beginning of my talk, we will probably need new words to depict it. If fascism is transhistorical, it is first and foremost because it is much more than a simple historiographical object. It is also a realm of memory that affects our present and our political imagination. Studying fascism would be pointless if it doesn't instill in us the consciousness that democracies are fragile conquests, that sometimes they implode, and that the history of the 20th century is also the history of their disintegration. This observation might seem banal, but it is certainly more timely today than it was 60 years ago when Mosse was discussing about fascism with his colleagues at Stanford. Thank you for your patience.
We have agreed to flip the sequence of the commentators, so we're going to go next to Renato Moro, who is Professor Emeritus of Contemporary History at Romaintre. And he's been Vice Rector for Research from 2004 to 2008, and Director of the PhD program Political Studies, and now is a member of the Ethical Board of the University. His studies concern the relationship between politics and religion in 20th century history, especially Catholic political culture, and the relationships between Italian Catholicism, fascism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Protestantism, and also the history of peace and anti-nuclear movements. And among his many books, he has written on the subjects of the formation of the Catholic ruling class, the Church and the extermination of the Jews, Catholicism and totalitarianism, fascism and Francoism, war and peace, 2 books on Aldo Moro, the image of the enemy, and the myth of Catholic Italy.
Thank you. Thank you to all the organizer. This conference, I beg your pardon, because for an abrupt commitment, I will have to leave at 6:30. There is time, fortunately, but I beg your pardon since now. Well, in the last months, I've been intensively reflecting on the proceedings of the Stanford 1963 seminar. And my impression is that the extraordinary strength it had was in the frank, direct dialogue among experts with the only goal of a better understanding of issues and interpretations. And I think that the same should happen in today's attempt by the MOSSE program to revive it. Hence, I will apply the same principles, and I will try to respond to Professor Traverso's keynote speech and open a dialogue with him. I'll be frank, direct, ready to change my mind, as many of the 1963 participants were. The problem at the center of Traverso's reflections is whether it is meaningful or useful to use the term fascism and fascist to describe contemporary political movements. I am a strong advocate of complexity. I have been continuously repeating to my students that they had to learn how to think in ambivalent terms. Why always yes or no, white or black? Instead, yes and no, white and black. So I appreciated very much Traverso's attempt to avoid univocal perspectives and solutions. I think that his effort has tried to avoid the widely spread trend of ghost-busting fascism, as Roger Griffin brilliantly put it a couple of years ago. Traverso, in his text, explicitly refuses Umberto Eco's category of an eternal fascism. And he proposes a complex and nuanced view of fascism, and at the same time, a complex and nuanced view of the new right. He has insisted in his last words on the fact that the neoconservative right is full of contradictions, and I have appreciated this very much. You have listened to the ambivalent elements, differences, continuities of the new far right and classical fascism. I have found many of his considerations illuminating on ideology, style, practice, values of the new radical right, and I have changed my mind in many cases. At the same time, I have to clearly confess that I have doubts and questions about, well, both about the methodological premises of his discourse and about his conclusions. First premise, fascism is not only transnational, but also trans-historical. You have heard, the reason is that first and foremost, fascism is much more than a simple historiographical object. It's a realm of memory that affects our present and our political imagination. The fact that fascism is not only a phenomenon of the past is undisputable. Still today, there are leaders, activists, movements, and parties that refer to past fascist experience in history, want to achieve similar values and views, and use symbols, gestures, slogans typical of fascism. Sky Donay this morning recalled George Moss's idea that bits of pieces of fascism are still circulating. I totally agree with this. However, I don't think that this makes fascism trans-historical. It simply says it is still alive. The relevance of the political imagination, of the collective image of fascism is undeniable. Nevertheless, is it not this a feature of almost every historical phenomenon? From Caesar to Constantine, from feudalism to the Crusades, from the Reformation to the Roman Inquisition, from the Battle of Lepanto to the seizure of the Bastille, and from Napoleon to Bismarck, every manifestation of the past has been accompanied or followed by a collective perception that has amplified, transformed, sometimes betrayed its reality. Does this make all those phenomena trans-historical? Or on the contrary, does it make them doubly historical? That is, an historical phenomenon in their essence and a historical phenomenon in their perception? And furthermore, is the historian's task to mix or superimpose those two dimensions, or clearly distinguish them and analyze them separately? Second premise. Second premise is that there is a sort of structural difference between the 1963 Stanford discussions on fascism and the present. Contrary to now, in 1963, fascism was a bygone experience. And talking about fascism meant talking about the past. According to Traverso, what was then said about McCarthyism was simply an allusion. Well, in a certain sense, this statement is undisputable again. It is evident that today's global rightist wave is not comparable with the rightist trends of the 60s. However, after reading the minutes of the Stanford seminar, I drew a quite different impression. In my opinion, McCarthyism played not a secondary, but a relevant role in those talks. After all, the attention to current events was then an intensive preoccupation for Mossi. In his book, Karel Plessini demonstrated that the crisis of the German ideology, the book at the root of the seminar, was born out of a double concern, I'm quoting her, a double concern with the past on the one hand and the present on the other. And in the book introduction, Mossi pointed the finger at some extremist groups, not only in Germany, also in the United States, that fused anti-Jewish and anti-African American sentiments. Mosse considered them little influential, but believed that they could still, in time of crisis, represent a danger, helping to create a racist mood by slowly poisoning institutions from the inside. So I wonder if confronting the 1963 seminar from today's perspective, we have a difference in nature or simply a difference in intensity, and that many of the issues that were then debated are very similar to the one of the present. So my convention is that ideas about the problem of using the terms fascism and fascist to describe contemporary political movements, then as well as now, depend on which interpretation of fascism you give. At Stanford, Mosse tried to convince the audience that fascism, seen in an unavoidable comparative perspective, was not only a political regime, but a culture, an original ideology, and even a new religion, he suggested. That it was a revolutionary movement, the wish to create a new attitude towards life and a new man, flying, he used the word, in mythical thinking. This approach caused him to deny that McCarthyism might be considered fascist, lacking almost all of those elements. But Mosse, at Stanford, was heavily contested by many scholars who denied the central role of ideology, differentiated between words and facts, insisted on power and political maneuvering, highlighted the centrality of foreign policy and revisionism, admitted that fascism might have been revolutionary in its methods, but denied it was revolutionary in its goals, and hence stressed its compromise with traditional elites. In this second perspective, establishing a link between historical fascism and many other rightist current trends was much, and is much, easier. And I think that things are not very different now. It is true, historiography, we have listened today many things about this. Historiography deeply changed. We have appreciated the decisive role of the First World War. We have seen the role of the middle classes' answer to modernity's and mass society. We have focused on the importance of the secularization of politics. We have understood the relevance on gender issues and normative masculinity. We have seen fascism as a global phenomenon. We have stressed its imperialist nature, its expansionist action. We have apprehended the existence of web exchanges between fascists and the liberal rightist movement. All these new interpretations have made our view of fascism more complex, of course. However, I think they cannot transform fascism into a hybrid, contradictory, Janus-faced entity without individuality, originality, and autonomy. When fascism is defined as a form of liberal totalitarianism, when it is interpreted as any global counter-revolutionary and anti-progressive stance, or simply as an aggressive, coercive, and violent movement, or a form of polycratic social and political practice based on homogeneous and racist communities, when it is identified in the mere intervention of the state or an Islamic terrorism, as it has been done, I think we risk to lose any conceptual or historical accuracy and enter the Hegelian night in which all cows are black. I do not deny that some relevant changes can happen in today's fascist movements with respect to classical fascism. What I'm not ready to accept is that fascism may become more or less everything with a connection with violence, intolerance, xenophobia, racism, discrimination, nativism, and colonialism. We know very well that not every fascist was a xenophobic, racist, or colonialist, and that not every xenophobic, racist, or colonialist was a fascist. We have a great tradition of studies of fascism, which Mossi was one of the more brilliant exponents, and I think we must not forget its main results. Concluding his groundbreaking study on fascism in a comparative perspective, Stanley Payne, locating and researching this tradition, defined fascism as a new epoch-making revolutionary phenomenon with an ideology and a peculiar assembly of its revendications. I think we have to follow these suggestions and try to individuate some key features essential to every fascism, the classical and today's fascist group and movements. The form of a militia party, that is, military mass organization, uses violence, the revolutionary element, the aspiration to an anthropological revolution, the totalitarian abolition of any distinction between public and private life, the presence of a political religion with symbols, rituals, saints, and martyrs, an integral imperialist warmongering militarism. By the way, on totalitarianism, I would suggest to reconsider the complete Moses' negation of the category. It is true, Moses refused it explicitly, but refused it because he was afraid of its applications to the comparative interpretation of the Soviet regime, but continued to use the concept as a total aspiration, as a goal to totalitarian control of society. At Stanford, for example, at Stanford, he expressed his doubts on the term, but he added that they were on the word as it is generally used. And in another discussion, he admitted that the seminar discussion were on a tradition that ended up in totalitarianism. He used the word. Let's go back to the features. If these are the suggestions coming from the best fascist studies, we can follow them in addressing the problem of applying the concept of fascism to today's far right. I think that Mosse himself showed the way. There is Mosse's not well-known text, his 1979 interview about the Italian Christian democratic leader Aldo Moro, which is dominated, totally dominated by the issue of the crisis of present democracy. These are Mosse's words. I think that not only as the strength of liberalism and parliamentary government in Western Europe yet to be tested, but the 1970s opened the first post-war decade of scarcity now that the expansion has reached its limits. What effect will this have? Will this not in fact make the old political parties obsolete? Will we not need a new political system to deal with a quite unprecedented fact, the fact of scarcities of the limits or resources? Historians are bad prophets, but I believe that the new age of scarcity, even if it does not take the same form as the Great Depression or the crisis of the First World War, will lead to strains and stresses that may produce forms of government which I cannot prophesy. I have said before, and I want to re-emphasize, I do not think history repeats itself. I do not think that because of this crisis, we will once again enter a fascist epoch. Perhaps bits and pieces of authoritarianism will be used, but they will be put together in a different way. I think this position is illuminating for the 1970s, but illuminating also for our present. Today we have authoritarianism aplenty, but are we entering a fascist epoch? Many of the leaders or movements under scrutiny as fascists not only lack all the fundamental elements historiography suggests, but show ideas or inclinations deeply contrary to the fascist ones. Many of them revere the sovereignty of popular will, consider electoral consent as the only legitimization of power, introduce themselves as representatives of the people. On the contrary, the fascists abhorred parties, wanted to abolish them and introduce themselves as an aristocratic minority despising the masses. Many of today's radical rightists are racist and xenophobic. Of course, the Nazis were, but other fascists, the Italians, for example, were not so for almost 20 years. Today's ultra-right is often independentist. Fascists hope for the strongest possible nation. Today's populists are anti-migrants. Fascists wish to enlarge the country to foreigners. In the end, my opinion is similar to what Roger Griffin has colorfully noted about the leader of the British radical right, Nigel Farage. You can be a total xenophobic, racist, male, chauvinist bastard and still not be a fascist. In the book on fascism, I just mentioned, Stanley Payne recommends never to confuse fascists, conservatives, and nationalist rightists. I fully share his advice. I think that the danger to the stability of Western democracies does not come from fascism now, but exactly from the conservative right. Therefore, in spite of my love for complexity and ambivalence, I do not share Traverso's conclusions. Post-fascism, para-fascism, quasi-fascism, and fascism-inspired seem to me categories that elude the real problem. The fact that a political phenomenon does not like us does not make it fascist, nor makes it fascist the fact that this phenomenon may be a relevant danger to democracy. As I already anticipated, I think fascism is still with us, though only as a minority affair, fortunately. Professor Traverso is probably right in suggesting that the definition of this new reality as populist is misleading. But I think post-fascism is deceptive as well. I think, as Mosse suggested, that this new far-right surge can be better understood as a new form of authoritarianism. But beware, not accepting the fascist connotation of the new radical right does not mean diminishing the relevance of today's severe menaces for democracy. Perhaps the only good reason I see for the repeated call to fascist danger is the invitation not to undervalue this. Nevertheless, framing the problem, as Traverso does, I think is risky. Equating today's political trends, even in an indirect way, to fascism is, in my opinion, historically inexact, as I tried to prove, but also politically dangerous. First, stressing the recurring return of fascism implies giving fascism a strength I think it has not. Young people who do not know anything about real historical fascism may be impressed by the mythical vision of an ever-resurging movement. Second, if we continue to see fascism everywhere, we risk removing our attention from the real dangers and menaces that still threaten democracy and that have nothing to do with fascism. The fact that the new forms of ultra-rightism generally avoid declaring, as fascists did, that the time for democracy ended does not make them less dangerous. If anything, I think they are even more dangerous because past historical experience taught us how to mobilize antibodies against fascism. At the same time, we have to invent now our answer mechanisms against these new enemies from nothing. Third, accentuating the fascist feature of today's mass politics means to undervalue another deep and I think unnoticed change, the end of anti-fascism as a discriminating factor in the conservative discourse. Many politicians and intellectuals from the right put fascism and anti-fascism at the same negative level, suggesting to overcome both, or rather consider anti-fascism today as today's authoritarianism. This is a cultural change on which I urge historians to reflect. Conclude. Please consider what you like about my considerations, but I am sure that we, including Enzo Traverso, will agree on at least one point. In the present situation, the historical study of fascism is more important than ever. We need to remember every day, as George Mosse did and as Traverso in his conclusions recalled, that democracies are not invincible and that the great gift we have the fortune to have can be easily lost and has to be defended at any cost. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Alyssa, my mentor, is a professor at Sciences Po, historian of gender, sexuality, and everyday life, whose research focuses on violence and war and dictatorship, particularly Nazism. Her first book, Female SS Guards and Workaday Violence, was on the Majdanek concentration camp, and since then she's also written numerous articles on perpetrator